Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring Christmas. A Kidnapped Santa Claus by L. Frank Baum. The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry. Not a Creature Was Stirring by Dean Evans. Fairyland Planet by John Silletto. The Festival by H. P. Lovecraft. A Kidnapped Santa Claus by L. Frank Baum, originally published in The Delineator, December 1904. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Santa Claus lives in the Laughing Valley, where stands the big rambling castle in which his toys are manufactured. His workmen, selected from the Ryls, Knooks, Pixies and Fairies, live with him, and every one is as busy as can be from one year's end to another. It is called the Laughing Valley because everything there is happy and gay. The brook chuckles to itself as it leaps rollicking between its green banks. The wind whistles merrily in the trees. The sunbeams dance lightly over the soft grass, and the violets and wild flowers look smilingly up from their green nests. To laugh, one needs to be happy. To be happy, one needs to be content. And throughout the Laughing Valley of Santa Claus, contentment reigns supreme. On one side is the mighty forest of Burzee. At the other side stands the huge mountain that contains the caves of the demons. And between them the valley lies smiling and peaceful. One would think that a good old Santa Claus, who devotes his days to making children happy, would have no enemies on all the earth. And, as a matter of fact, for a long period of time he encountered nothing but love wherever he might go. But the demons who live in the mountain caves grew to hate Santa Claus very much, and all for the simple reason that he made children happy. The caves of the demons are 5 in number. A broad pathway leads up to the first cave, which is a finely arched cavern at the foot of the mountain, the entrance being beautifully carved and decorated. In it resides the demon of selfishness. Back of this is another cavern inhabited by the demon of envy. The cave of the demon of hatred is next in order, and through this one passes to the home of the demon of malice, situated in a dark and fearful cave in the very heart of the mountain. I do not know what lies beyond this. Some say there are terrible pitfalls leading to death and destruction, and this may very well be true. However, from each one of the 4 caves mentioned, there is a small, narrow tunnel leading to the 5th cave, a cosy little room occupied by the demon of repentance. And as the rocky floors of these passages are well worn by the track of passing feet, I judge that many wanderers in the caves of the demons have escaped through the tunnels to the abode of the demon of repentance, who is said to be a pleasant sort of fellow, who gladly opens for one a little door admitting you into fresh air and sunshine again. Well, these demons of the caves, thinking they had great cause to dislike old Santa Claus, held a meeting one day to discuss the matter. "I'm really getting lonesome," said the demon of selfishness, "for Santa Claus distributes so many pretty Christmas gifts to all the children that they become happy and generous through his example and keep away from my cave." "I'm having the same trouble," rejoined the demon of envy. "The little ones seem quite content with Santa Claus, and there are few, indeed, that I can coax to become envious." "And that makes it bad for me," declared the demon of hatred, For if no children pass through the caves of selfishness and envy, None can get to my cavern." "Or to mine," added the demon of malice. "For my part," said the demon of repentance, "it is easily seen that if children do not visit your caves, they have no need to visit mine, so that I am quite as neglected as you are." "And all because of this person they call Santa Claus," exclaimed the demon of envy. "He is simply ruining our business, and something must be done at once." To this they readily agreed, but what to do was another and more difficult matter to settle. They knew that Santa Claus worked all through the year at his castle in the Laughing Valley, preparing the gifts he was to distribute on Christmas Eve, and at first they resolved to try to tempt him into their caves, that they might lead him on to the terrible pitfalls that ended in destruction. So the very next day, while Santa Claus was busily at work, surrounded by his little band of assistants, the demon of selfishness came to him and said, "These toys are wonderfully bright and pretty. Why do you not keep them for yourself? It's a pity to give them to those noisy boys and fretful girls who break and destroy them so quickly." "Nonsense!" cried the old greybeard, his bright eyes twinkling merrily as he turned toward the tempting demon. "The boys and girls are never so noisy and fretful after receiving my presents, and if I can make them happy for one day in the year, I am quite content." So the demon went back to the others who awaited him in their caves and said, "I have failed, for Santa Claus is not at all selfish." The following day, the demon of envy visited Santa Claus. Said he, "The toy shops are full of playthings quite as pretty as those you are making. What a shame it is that they should interfere with your business. They make toys by machinery much quicker than you can make them by hand, and they sell them for money, while you get nothing at all for your work." But Santa Claus refused to be envious of the toy shops. "I can supply the little ones but once a year, on Christmas Eve," he answered, "for the children are many, and I am but one. And as my work is one of love and kindness, I would be ashamed to receive money for my little gifts. But throughout all the year the children must be amused in some way, and so the toy shops are able to bring much happiness to my little friends. I like the toy shops, and am glad to see them prosper." In spite of the second rebuff, the demon of hatred thought he would try to influence Santa Claus. So the next day he entered the busy workshop and said, "Good morning, Santa. I have bad news for you." "Then run away like a good fellow," answered Santa Claus. "Bad news is something that should be kept secret and never told." "You cannot escape this, however," declared the demon, "for in the world are a good many who do not believe in Santa Claus, and these you are bound to hate bitterly, since they have so wronged you." "Stuff and rubbish," cried Santa. "And there are others who resent your making children happy, and who sneer at you and call you a foolish old rattlepate. You are quite right to hate such base slanderers, and you ought to be revenged upon them for their evil words." "But I don't hate them," exclaimed Santa Claus positively. "Such people do me no real harm, but merely render themselves and their children unhappy. Poor things! I'd much rather help them any day than injure them." Indeed, the demons could not tempt old Santa Claus in any way. On the contrary, he was shrewd enough to see that their object in visiting him was to make mischief and trouble, and his cheery laughter disconcerted the evil ones and showed them to the folly of such an undertaking. So they abandoned honeyed words and determined to use force. It was well known that no harm can come to Santa Claus while he is in the Laughing Valley, for the fairies and ryls and knooks all protect him. But on Christmas Eve he drives his reindeer out into the big world, carrying a sleigh load of toys and pretty gifts to the children, and this was the time and the occasion when his enemies had the best chance to injure him. So the demons laid their plans and awaited the arrival of Christmas Eve. The moon shone big and white in the sky, and the snow lay crisp and sparkling on the ground as Santa Claus cracked his whip and sped away out of the valley into the great world beyond. The roomy sleigh was packed full with huge sacks of toys, and as the reindeer dashed onward, our jolly old Santa laughed and whistled and sang for very joy. For in all his merry life, this was the one day in the year when he was happiest, the day he lovingly bestowed the treasures of his workshop upon the little children. It would be a busy night for him, he well knew. As he whistled and shouted and cracked his whip again, he reviewed in mind all the towns and cities and farmhouses where he was expected, and figured that he had just enough presents to go around and make every child happy. The reindeer knew exactly what was expected of them, and dashed along so swiftly that their feet scarcely seemed to touch the snow-covered ground. Suddenly a strange thing happened. A rope shot through the moonlight, and a big noose that was in the end of it settled over the arms and body of Santa Claus and drew tight. Before he could resist or even cry out, he was jerked from the seat of the sleigh and tumbled head foremost into a snowbank, while the reindeer rushed onward with a load of toys and carried it quickly out of sight and sound. Such a surprising experience confused old Santa for a moment, and when he had collected his senses, he found that the wicked demons had pulled him from the snowdrift and bound him tightly with many coils of the stout rope. And then they carried the kidnapped Santa Claus away to the mountain, where they thrust the prisoner into a secret cave and chained him to the rocky wall so that he could not escape. "Ha, ha!" laughed the demons, rubbing their hands together with cruel glee. "What will the children do now? How they will cry and scold and storm when they find there are no toys in their stockings and no gifts on their Christmas trees! And what a lot of punishment they will receive from their parents, and how they will flock to our caves of selfishness and envy and hatred and malice. We have done a mighty clever things, we demons of the caves." Now it so chanced that on this Christmas Eve the good Santa Claus had taken with him in his sleigh Nuta the Rill, Peter the Knook, Kilter the Pixie, and a small fairy named Whisk, his 4 favourite assistants. These little people had often found very useful in helping him to distribute his gifts to the children, and when the master was so suddenly dragged from the sleigh, they were all snugly tucked underneath the seat, where the sharp wind could not reach them. The tiny immortals knew nothing of the capture of Santa Claus until some time after he had disappeared. But finally they missed his cheery voice, and as their master always sang or whistled on his journeys, the silence warned them that something was wrong. Little Whisk stuck out his head from underneath the seat and found Santa Claus gone, and no one to direct the flight of the reindeer. "Whoa!" he called out, and the deer obediently slackened speed and came to a halt. Peter and Nuta and Kilter all jumped upon the seat and looked back over the track made by the sleigh, but Santa Claus had been left miles and miles behind. "What shall we do?" asked Whisk anxiously, all the mirth and mischief banished from his wee face by this great calamity. "We must go back at once and find our master," said Nuta the Rill, who thought and spoke with much deliberation. "No, no," exclaimed Peter the Knook, who, cross and crabbed though he was, might always be depended upon in an emergency. "If we delay or go back, there will not be time to get the toys to the children before morning, and that would grieve Santa Claus more than anything else." "It's certain that some wicked creatures have captured him," added Kilter thoughtfully, "and their object must be to make the children unhappy. So our first duty is to get the toys distributed as carefully as if Santa Claus were himself present. Afterward we can search for our master and easily secure his freedom." This seemed such a good and sensible advice that the others at once resolved to adopt it. So Peter the Knook called to the reindeer, and the faithful animals again sprang forward and dashed over hill and valley, through forest and plain, until they came to the houses wherein children lay sleeping and dreaming of the pretty gifts they would find on Christmas morning. The little immortals had set themselves a difficult task, for although they had assisted Santa Claus on many of his journeys, their master had always directed and guided them, and told them exactly what he wished them to do. But now they had to distribute the toys according to their own judgment, and they did not understand children as well as did old Santa. So it is no wonder they made some laughable errors. Mamie Brown, who wanted a doll, got a drum instead, and a drum is of no use to a girl who loves dolls. And Charlie Smith, who delights to romp and play out of doors, and who wanted some new rubber boots to keep his feet dry, received a sewing box filled with coloured worsteds and threads and needles, which made him so provoked that he thoughtlessly called our dear Santa Claus a fraud. Had there been many such mistakes, the demons would have accomplished their evil purpose and made the children unhappy. But the little friends of the absent Santa Claus laboured faithfully and intelligently to carry out their master's ideas, and they made fewer errors than might be expected under such unusual circumstances. And, although they worked as swiftly as possible, day had begun to break before the toys and other presents were all distributed, so for the first time in many years the reindeer trotted into the Laughing Valley on their return in broad daylight, with the brilliant sun peeping over the edge of the forest to prove they were far behind their accustomed hours. Having put the deer in the stable, the little folk began to wonder how they might rescue their master, and they realized they must discover, first of all, what had happened to him and where he was. So Whisk the fairy transported himself to the bower of the Fairy Queen, which was located deep in the heart of the forest of Burzee, and once there, it did not take him long to find out all about the naughty demons and how they had kidnapped the good Santa Claus to prevent his making children happy. The Fairy Queen also promised her assistance, and then, fortified by this powerful support, Whisk flew back to where Neuter and Peter and Kilter awaited him, and the four counselled together and laid plans to rescue their master from his enemies. It is possible that Santa Claus was not as merry as usual during the night that succeeded his capture, for although he had faith in the judgment of his little friends, he could not avoid a certain amount of worry, and an anxious look would creep at times into his kind old eyes as he thought of the disappointment that might await his dear little children. And the demons, who guarded him by turns, one after another, did not neglect to taunt him with contemptuous words in his helpless condition. When Christmas Day dawned, the demon of malice was guarding the prisoner, and his tongue was sharper than that of any of the others. "The children are waking up, Santa," he cried. "They are waking up to find their stockings empty. Ho, ho! How will they quarrel, and wail, and stamp their feet in anger? Our caves will be full today, old Santa. Our caves are sure to be full." But to this, as to other like taunts, Santa Claus answered nothing. He was much grieved by his capture, it is true, but his courage did not forsake him, and finding that the prisoner would not reply to his jeers, the demon of malice presently went away, and sent the demon of repentance to take his place. This last personage was not so disagreeable as the others. He had gentle and refined features, and his voice was soft and pleasant in tone. "My brother demons do not trust me overmuch," said he as he entered the cavern. "But it is morning now, and the mischief is done. You cannot visit the children again for another year." "That is true," answered Santa Claus, almost cheerfully. "Christmas Eve is past, and for the first time in centuries I have not visited my children." "The little ones will be greatly disappointed," murmured the demon of repentance, almost regretfully. "But that cannot be helped now. Their grief is likely to make the children selfish and envious and hateful, and if they come to the caves of the demons today, I shall get a chance to lead some of them to my cave of repentance." "Do you never repent yourself?" asked Santa Claus curiously. "Oh, yes, indeed," answered the demon. "I am even now repenting that I assisted in your capture. Of course it is too late to remedy the evil that has been done, but repentance, you know, can come only after an evil thought or deed, for in the beginning there is nothing to repent of." "So I understand," said Santa Claus. "Those who avoid evil need never visit your cave." "As a rule that is true," replied the demon, "yet you, who have done no evil, are about to visit my cave at once, for to prove that I sincerely regret my share in your capture, I am going to permit you to escape." This speech greatly surprised the prisoner, until he reflected that it was just what might be expected of the demon of repentance. The fellow at once busied himself untying the knots that bound Santa Claus and unlocking the chains that fastened him to the wall. Then he led the way through a long tunnel until they both emerged in the cave of repentance. "I hope you will forgive me," said the demon pleadingly. "I am not really a bad person, you know, and I believe I accomplish a great deal of good in the world." With this, he opened a back door that let in a flood of sunshine, and Santa Claus sniffed the fresh air gratefully. "I bear no malice," said he to the demon in a gentle voice, "and I am sure the world would be a dreary place without you. So good morning, and a Merry Christmas to you." With these words he stepped out to greet the bright morning, and a moment later he was trudging along, whistling softly to himself, on his way to his home in the Laughing Valley. Marching over the snow toward the mountain was a vast army, made up of the most curious creatures imaginable. There were numberless knooks from the forest, as rough and crooked in appearance as the gnarled branches of the trees they ministered to, and there were dainty rills from the fields, each one bearing the emblem of the flower or plant it guarded. Behind these were many ranks of pixies, gnomes, and nymphs, and in the rear 1,000 beautiful fairies floated along in gorgeous array. This wonderful army was led by Whisk, Peter, Neuter, and Kilter, who had assembled it to rescue Santa Claus from captivity and to punish the demons who had dared to take him away from his beloved children. And although they looked so bright and peaceful, the little immortals were armed with powers that would be very terrible to those who had incurred their anger. Woe to the demons of the caves if this mighty army of vengeance ever met them. But lo! Coming to meet his loyal friends appeared the imposing form of Santa Claus, his white beard floating in the breeze, and his bright eyes sparkling with pleasure at this proof of their love and veneration he had inspired in the hearts of the most powerful creatures in existence. And while they clustered around him and danced with glee at his safe return, he gave them earnest thanks for their support. But Whisk and Neuter and Peter and Kilter he embraced affectionately. "It is useless to pursue the demons," said Santa Claus to the army. "They have their place in the world, and can never be destroyed. But that is a great pity, nevertheless," he continued musingly. So the fairies and nooks and pixies and rills all escorted the good man to his castle, and there left him to talk over the events of the night with his little assistants. Whisk had already rendered himself invisible, and flown through the big world to see how the children were getting along on this bright Christmas morning. And by the time he returned, Peter had finished telling Santa Claus of how they had distributed the toys. "We really did very well," cried the fairy in a pleased voice, "for I found little unhappiness among the children this morning. Still, you must not get captured again, my dear master, for we might not be so fortunate another time in carrying out your ideas." He then related the mistakes that had been made, and which he had not discovered until his tour of inspection. And Santa Claus at once sent him with rubber boots for Charlie Smith and a doll for Mamie Brown, so that even those two disappointed ones became happy. As for the wicked demons of the caves, they were filled with anger and chagrin when they found out their clever capture of Santa Claus had come to naught. Indeed, no one on that Christmas day appeared to be at all selfish, or envious, or hateful. And, realizing that while the children's saint had so many powerful friends, it was folly to oppose him, the demons never again attempted to interfere with his journeys on Christmas Eve. The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry. Originally published in the New York Sunday World, December 10th, 1905. Narrated by Tom Trussel. $1.87. That was all, and 60 cents of it was in pennies. Pennies saved 1 and 2 at a time by bulldozing the grocer and the vegetable man and the butcher until one's cheeks burned with the silent imputation of parsimony that such close dealing implied. 3 times Della counted it. $1.87, and the next day would be Christmas. There was clearly nothing to do but flop down on the shabby little couch and howl. So Della did it, which instigates the moral reflection that life is made up of sobs, sniffles, and smiles, with sniffles predominating. While the mistress of the home is gradually subsiding from the first stage to the second, take a look at the home. A furnished flat at $8 per week. It did not exactly beggar description, but it certainly had that word on the lookout for the mendicancy squad. In the vestibule below was a letterbox into which no letter would go, and an electric button from which no mortal finger could coax a ring. Also appertaining thereunto was a card bearing the name Mr. James Dillingham Young. The Dillingham had been flung to the breeze during a former period of prosperity when its possessor was being paid $30 per week. Now, when the income was shrunk to $20, though, they were thinking seriously of contracting to a modest and unassuming D. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim, and greatly hugged by Mrs. James Dillingham Young, already introduced to you as Della, which is all very good. Della finished her cry and attended to her cheeks with a powder rag. She stood by the window and looked out dully at a grey cat walking a grey fence in a grey backyard. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and she had only $1.87 with which to buy Jim a present. She had been saving every penny she could for months, with this result. $20 a week doesn't go far. Expenses had been greater than she had calculated. They always are. Only $1.87 to buy a present for Jim. Her Jim. Many a happy hour she had spent planning for something nice for him. Something fine and rare and sterling. Something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honour of being owned by Jim. There was a pier-glass between the windows of the room. Perhaps you've seen a pier-glass in an $8 flat. A very thin and very agile person may, by observing his reflection in a rapid sequence of longitudinal strips, obtain a fairly accurate conception of his looks. Della, being slender, had mastered the art. Suddenly she whirled from the window and stood before the glass. Her eyes were shining brilliantly, but her face had lost its colour within 20 seconds. Rapidly she pulled down her hair and let it fall to its full length. Now, there were 2 possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs in which they both took a mighty pride. One was Jim's gold watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's. The other was Della's hair. Had the Queen of Sheba lived in the flat across the air shaft, Della would have let her hair hang out the window some day to dry, just to depreciate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. Had King Solomon been the janitor, with all his treasures piled up in the basement, Jim would have pulled out his watch every time he passed, just to see him pluck at his beard from envy. So now, Della's beautiful hair fell about her, rippling and shining like a cascade of brown waters. It reached below her knee and made itself almost a garment for her. And then she did it up again nervously and quickly. Once she faltered for a minute and stood still while a tear or two splashed on the worn red carpet. On went her old brown jacket, on went her old brown hat. With a whirl of skirts and with a brilliant sparkle still in her eyes, she fluttered out the door and down the stairs to the street. Where she stopped, the sign read, Madame Sophronie, hair goods of all kinds. One flight up Della ran and collected herself, panting. Madame, large, too white, chilly, hardly looked the Sophronie. "Will you buy my hair?" asked Della. "I buy hair," said Madame. "Take your hat off and let's have a sight at the looks of it." Down rippled the brown cascade. $20, said Madame, lifting the mass with a practised hand. "Give it to me quick," said Della. Oh, and the next 2 hours tripped by on rosy wings. Forget the hashed metaphor. She was ransacking the stores for Jim's present. She found it at last. It surely had been made for Jim and no one else. There was no other like it in any of the stores, and she had turned all of them inside out. It was a platinum fob chain, simple and chaste in design, probably proclaiming its value by substance alone and not by meretricious ornamentation, as all good things should do. It was even worthy of the watch. As soon as she saw it, she knew that it must be Jim's. It was like him, quietness and value. The description applied to both. $21 they took from her for it, and she hurried home with the 87 cents. With that chain on his watch, Jim might be properly anxious about the time in any company. Grand as the watch was, he sometimes looked at it on the sly on account of the old leather strap that he used in place of a chain. When Della reached home, her intoxication gave way a little to prudence and reason. She got out her curling irons and lighted the gas and went to work repairing the ravages made by generosity added to love. Which is always a tremendous task, dear friends, a mammoth task. Within 40 minutes, her head was covered with tiny close-lying curls that made her look wonderfully like a truant schoolboy. She looked at her reflection in the mirror long, carefully and critically. "If Jim doesn't kill me," she said to herself, "before she takes a second look at me, he'll say I look like a Coney Island chorus girl. But what could I do? Oh, what could I do with $1.87? At 7 o'clock the coffee was made, and the frying pan was on the back of the stove, hot and ready to cook the chops. Jim was never late. Della doubled the fob chain in her hand and sat on the corner on the table near the door that he always entered. Then she heard his step on the stair away down on the first flight, and she turned white for just a moment. She had a habit of saying a little silent prayer about the simplest everyday things, and now she whispered, "Please, God, make him think I am still pretty." The door opened, and Jim stepped in and closed it. He looked thin and very serious. Poor fellow, he was only 22, and to be burdened with a family. He needed a new overcoat, and he was without gloves. Jim stopped inside the door, as immovable as a setter at the scent of a quail. His eyes were fixed upon Della, and there was an expression in them that she could not read, and it terrified her. It was not anger, nor surprise, nor disapproval, nor horror, nor any of the sentiments that she had been prepared for. He simply stared at her fixedly with that peculiar expression on his face. Della wriggled off the table and went for him. "Jim, darling," she cried, "don't look at me that way.
I had my hair cut off and sold because I couldn't have lived through Christmas without giving you a present. It'll grow out again. You won't mind, will you? I just had to do it. My hair grows awfully fast. Say Merry Christmas, Jim, and let's be happy. You don't know what a beautiful, nice gift I've got for you."
"You've cut off your hair?" asked Jim laboriously, as if he had not arrived at that patent fact yet even after the hardest mental labour.
"Cut it off and sold it," said Della. "Don't you like me just as well, anyhow? I'm me without my hair, ain't I?"
Jim looked about the room curiously. "You say your hair is gone?" he said, with an air almost of idiocy.
"You needn't look for it," said Della. "It's sold, I tell you. Sold and gone, too. It's Christmas Eve, boy. Be good to me, for it went for you. Maybe the hairs of my head were numbered," she went on with sudden serious sweetness. "But nobody could ever count my love for you. Shall I put the chops on, Jim?"
Out of his trance, Jim seemed quickly to wake. He enfolded his Della. "For 10 seconds let us regard with discreet scrutiny some inconsequential object in the other direction. $8 a week, or $1 million a year. What is the difference? A mathematician or a wit would give you the wrong answer. The Magi brought valuable gifts, but that was not among them. This dark assertion will be illuminated later on." Jim drew a package from his overcoat pocket and threw it upon the table. "Don't make any mistake, Dell," he said, "about me. I don't think there's anything in the way of a haircut or a shave or a shampoo that could make me like my girl any less. But if you'll unwrap that package, you may see why you had me going a while at first." White fingers and nimble tore at the string and paper, and then an ecstatic scream of joy, and then, alas! a quick feminine change to hysterical tears and wails, necessitating the immediate employment of all the comforting powers of the lord of the flat. For there lay the combs, the set of combs, side and back, that Della had worshipped long in a Broadway window. Beautiful combs, pure tortoise-shell, with jewelled rims, just the shade to wear in the beautiful vanished hair. They were expensive combs, she knew, and her heart had simply craved and yearned over them without the least hope of possession. And now they were hers, but the tresses that should have adorned the coveted adornments were gone. But she hugged them to her bosom, and at length she was able to look up with dim eyes and a smile and say, "My hair grows so fast, Jim." And then Della leaped up like a little singed cat and cried, "Oh, oh!" Jim had not yet seen his beautiful present. She held it out to him eagerly upon her open palm. The dull, precious metal seemed to flash with the reflection of her bright and ardent spirit. "Isn't it a dandy, Jim? I hunted all over town to find it. You'll have to look at the time 100 times a day now. Give me your watch. I want to see how it looks on it." Instead of obeying, Jim tumbled down on the couch and put his hands under the back of his head and smiled. "Dell," said he, "let's put our Christmas presents away and keep 'em a while. They're too nice to use just at present. I sold the watch to get the money to buy our combs. And now suppose you put the chops on." The Magi, as you know, were wise men, wonderfully wise men, who brought gifts to the babe in the manger. They invented the art of giving Christmas presents. Being wise, their gifts were no doubt wise ones, possibly bearing the privilege of exchange in case of duplication. And here I have lamely related to you the uneventful chronicle of 2 foolish children in a flat who most unwisely sacrificed for each other the greatest treasures of their house. But in a last word to the wise of these days, let it be said that of all who give gifts, these 2 were the wisest. Of all who give and receive gifts, such as they are wisest.
Everywhere they are wisest. They are the Magi.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. Not a Creature Was Stirring by Dean Evans. Originally published in Galaxy, December 1951. Narrated by Tom Trussel. He was a tall, hard man, with skin the colour of very old iodine. When he climbed up out of the vertical shaft of his small gold mine, the lousy disappointment, he could have been taken for an Indian, he was that dark. Except, of course, that Indians didn't exist anymore in 1982. His name was Tom Gannett, and he was about 40 years old, and he didn't realize his own uniqueness. When he made it to his feet, the first thing he did was to squint up at the sun. The second was to sneeze, and the third to blow his nose. "Hey, you old son," he growled. "You old crummy son, you look sicker than a dog." Which was literally true, for the sun seemed to be pretty queer. The whole sky seemed to be pretty queer, for that matter. Skies should be blue, and the sun should be a bloated golden bauble drifting serenely across them. But the skies were not blue. They were a dirty purplish grey, and the sun wasn't a bloated golden bauble. Somebody had it by the scruff of the neck and was dragging it. Gannett planted his big feet wide apart and frowned sourly around, and sniffed the air like a dog at a gopher hole. "The damn world smells sick," he grunted. Which was also true. The world did smell sick. The world smelled something like that peculiar odour that comes from an old graveyard carefully tended by an old man with dank moss sticking to the soles of his old shoes. That kind of smell. Gannett didn't know why the sun looked sick, and he didn't know why the world smelled sick. Indeed, there were many things Gannett didn't know, among which would be these in particular. A. He did not know, since for the last 6 months he had been living and working all alone at his little mine, which was in the remotest of the most remote desert regions of Nevada, that a little less than 3 weeks earlier mankind had finally achieved the inevitable, man's own annihilation. B. He did not know that he was going to be the loneliest man on earth. He was used to, and perfectly content with, the hermit-like existence of a desert rat. C. He furthermore did not know that there were 4 of the 10 commandments which he wasn't going to be able to break any more, not even if he stayed up nights trying, and lived for centuries. Gannett snorted the smell from his nostrils and shrugged. Hell with it. He thought about Reno, and now he hadn't been there for nearly a year. He thought of the dimly lighted, soft-carpeted cocktail lounges in Reno, where drinks come in long-stemmed glasses and blondes in long-stemmed legs. Reno at Christmas time, he thought. There was a town. Reno. He grinned, showing big gold teeth that blazed out of his mouth like the glittering grill on a Buick. He dug his feet into the hard ground and walked the 100 feet or so to his cabin, where he sometimes slept when he didn't happen to sleep in the mine. He stripped off his grime-sodden clothes. He stepped out of them, in fact, and stretched luxuriously as though he hadn't felt the good joy of being unclothed for a long time. He got up and went to a corner of the cabin, rummaged out a pair of dusty clogs, and pushed his feet into them. Then, and they don't come any nakeder than he was, he went outside and around the shack to the rear, where he kept his jeep and where the shower was. He stepped into it, for it was nothing more ornate than a large oil drum suspended on long 4x6s. He yanked on a rope that hung down from the drum. The result of doing that made him leap out again, dripping wet and colder than a buried mother-in-law. He shivered, eyes blinking fast. He took a deep breath. His gold teeth went together tightly, and the big muscles in his neck corded defensively. He deliberately went under the shower again. Pouring a sliver of laundry soap from a ledge on one of the 4x6s, he went to work with it, and when he finally tripped the hanging rope once more, he was a clean man. He went into the cabin. It wasn't any warmer than the great outdoors, but that was where his clothes were. He shaved from an old granite basin full of cold water. After that, he went to a hook on the wall and got down a suit of clothes which looked as though it had shriveled up waiting for somebody to wear it. The last thing he did before leaving was to pry up one of the boards behind the door and lift out of this hiding place a small leather bag. The bag was filled with gold. The sun was gone now. Leg-like rays of light still sprawled, dirty-looking, in the sky over toward the California line, but aside from these extremities, most of it was somewhere out in the Pacific. The purplish sky was darker now, drab, dead somehow. The old jeep started nicely. It always started nicely. That was one of the good things about a jeep. The only funny thing was that out of its exhaust pipe in the rear came angry purplish flames. Queer flames. Gannett stared at them, surprised. "Even the damned jeep is sick," he muttered. He was wrong, of course, but he had no way of knowing that. He backed around, finally, and went down what he called his driveway, which was little more than rock-strewn ground, until he came to a small dirt road. This led him to another, larger dirt road, which in turn led him to route number 395, which was a U.S. highway. 100 miles farther on, he came to the outskirts of Carson City. It wasn't until he pulled into a gas station that he realized something was wrong. Nobody jumped out to wipe his windshield. The attendant who still leaned in the doorway of the station had a rag in his hand, but he didn't budge. He couldn't. His face looked like weathered leather, and he was dead. "Holy!" whispered Gannett incredulously. He forgot about needing gas. He jumped in the jeep and drove down the main stem and found police headquarters in an old grey stone building. He knew it was police headquarters, for the green neon over the revolving door had CPD on it, and it was still burning. He went up the steps 2 at a time, banged through the swinging doors, and stamped straight to where the sergeant sat at a desk over in the corner by the switchboard. "Hey, by God!" yelled Gannett to the desk sergeant. "There's a guy down the street in a gas station, and he's standing up in the doorway and he's dead as a mackerel." Dramatic words. But the desk sergeant was no longer among the living, and didn't appreciate them. It took Gannett a long while to get over that. He slowly backed away. He made the big oak doors, still backing. He went down the stairs on legs as stiff as icicles. He got back in his jeep and started up again. He knew there was something terribly wrong, but before he thought about it, he knew he had to have a drink. He pulled up in front of a saloon that had nice, cheery, glowing lights showing through the big front window. He got out of the jeep. He went through the swinging glass doors and straight to the bar. "Scotch!" Nobody answered. The barman behind the mahogany, facing him, didn't make a move. The barman had a dead cigarette between his cold, colourless lips. The cigarette had a half-inch of ash on it. The ash looked as though it was sculptured out of purple marble. Gannett put both hands flat on the bar and swallowed hard. He twisted his head and looked over the shoulder of a customer on his left, who was leaning negligently on the bar with one elbow. There was a half-full bottle in front of the leaning man, and it had an alert-looking horse's head stuck in the neck of it for a pouring spout. "Excuse me, Mac," Gannett whispered. The leaning man didn't twitch a muscle. Gannett sucked in a deep breath. He reached. He got the bottle. He blinked stupidly at the bottle, and then he put it down very carefully and took another breath and looked at a highball glass in front of the leaning man. The highball glass was empty and clean, but the leaning man's fingers were curled lightly and gracefully around it. They were nice fingers, white fingers, fingers that looked as if they hadn't had to do any hard work lately. Slender, tapering, carefully manicured fingers. Gannett swore softly. He yanked the horse's head out and then poked the bottle into his mouth and tilted it up. He held it until there wasn't anything left by the very glass it was made of, plus the bright little paper label. His throat burned. He coughed. He banged the empty bottle down on the bar top and coughed again, hard. The leaning man stirred, seemed to turn slowly, stiffly, in a half arc that put him face to face with Gannett. Then he went down backward, and all in one piece, like a tall tree on top of a hill on a very still night. He went down with a glass in his hand, and when he hit, swirls of thick dust rose lazily from the floor and then settled back over his rigid form like freshly falling snow blanketing something left out on the front lawn. The night was black. There wasn't a star, and there wasn't a sound, except for earth sounds, which are never very loud. Gannett sat in his jeep with the motor running and the purple flames coming out of the tailpipe. His hands were tight around the wheel, but the jeep wasn't moving. Gannett was staring off into space, and his eyes looked as though somebody had peeled them back. He said it to himself mentally, for the first few times. Then, as if he couldn't contain them any longer, the words tumbled out of his mouth into the night air. "Everybody's dead, by God!" He drove through deserted streets until he found an all-night drugstore. It didn't seem funny to him just yet that the streets were deserted. That was something he would think of later. He walked into the drugstore and went to the newsstand and picked up a copy of the Carson Daily Bugle. The date struck him first. It was the wrong date. It was 3 weeks ago. He dropped it and picked up another, a Reno paper this time. Same trouble with the date. He read the headline then. "Reds strike at Turkey. Unveil new weapon." He blinked at it. There was a little more, pitifully little, to the effect that Congress had been asked for a declaration of war in order to defend the assaulted member of the Atlantic Pact nations. Gannett swallowed hard. He dropped the paper and turned to the clerk who was leaning over the glass counter watching him. "Geez," Gannett said, "when did all this happen? I didn't even know about it." He didn't get any answer from the clerk. He knew he wouldn't from the way the clerk's eyes looked. They looked as if they should have been under refrigeration. "People around dead," he muttered. "By God, the governor ought to know about this." He left the drugstore and drove straight for the state capitol building, which wasn't far away, for Carson City isn't very large. He walked up the long concrete ribbon to the big stone steps. He mounted them. He stood before the bronze doors for an instant, a feeling of awe coming over him despite what he knew he was going to tell the governor. He pulled on the handle of the nearest of the bronze doors. Nothing happened. It was locked, of course. The Capitol is never open at 3 a.m., which was the exact time when it had happened 3 weeks ago, but he didn't know that. A feeling of rage came over Gannett slowly, like heat radiating through soft wood. He stood on the stone steps and faced the broad expanse of lawn, which in the summertime at least was very lovely. He slowly pulled his leather bag of gold from his coat pocket and raised it up so he could see it. Then he turned once more to the bronze doors and smashed the bag of gold through one of the glass panes. "Gannet done it," he roared. "If anybody wants to know, tell 'em Gannet, by God!" He went back to his jeep. The big, darkly hulking form of the red brick post office building went by and faded into the night. He passed a jewellery store. He looked in. An electric mantel clock in the store window indicated the time as 9:10. He passed a supermarket. The big illuminated clock on the facade said 9:07. The clock in the service station, where he finally pulled in for gas, pointed at 9 exactly. Cycles have to be controlled if electric clocks are to keep correct time, but that was something else he did not know. After he put back the gasoline hose, he left one more observation on the silence on the night before arriving to Reno. He said it loudly, and there was angry frustration in every word of it. "Hell with Carson City! To hell with it!" Approaching downtown Reno at night is a pleasant, cheerful experience. There are lights all around, like a store selling electric fixtures. On the right-hand side of Virginia Street, they glow brightly, each one a little gaudier than the last. Big lights. Neon lights in all the colours neon lights can come in. Signs on the fronts of the big gaming houses that stay open until lights aren't needed anymore. And the one flash of light across Virginia Street at the intersection of Commercial Row, which had been photographed more times than the mind of man could have conjectured. Reno, the biggest little city in the world. He drove slowly by the Happy Times Club. He could see quite a few people inside. You wouldn't think there was anything wrong when you looked at something like that. At the corner of First Street, he stopped for the signal. He pulled around a military vehicle that seemed to be waiting for the signal too. It was an open vehicle, painted the olive drab of the army, and sitting stiffly erect behind the wheel was a natty-looking first lieutenant with his cap at just the right angle over one eye. The signal bell up on the corner poles clanged loudly, and the lights turned green. Gannet crossed the intersection, but the lieutenant and his military vehicle stayed behind. He went by the Golden Bubble, which was perhaps the largest and gaudiest of all the gaming places in Reno. Its big front, done in glass bricks with multicolored lights behind them, looked like some monstrous kaleidoscope built for the use of the man in the moon. Seen from his jeep, through the plate glass of the wide door, the interior of the Golden Bubble seemed to be a happy, carousing place full of the joyous laughter of folks having a fine time. Only that wasn't so, of course, for the only sounds to be heard were the jeep's motor and the signal bells on the corner poles. Gannet parked. He walked back, went slowly through the doors of the Golden Bubble. The first thing that met his eyes was the flashing welcome grin of the head waiter, who was dressed in a tuxedo just inside the doors. The head waiter had his hand half out, as if to shake the hand of Gannet as he came in. Gannet almost stuck out his own hand in return, but not quite. He went to the bar. He didn't look at the barman lying on the floor with his ears in the spittoon. He shambled around the end of the bar, took a full bottle of scotch off the back bar shelf, broke the seal, and took a long swallow. The bartender didn't notice. After that, he took the bottle with him out on the floor. He went around a man in an overcoat who looked to be uncomfortably warm but wasn't. He went over to a roulette table and stared the croupier straight in the eyes. He reached for a pile of chips under the croupier's right hand and slid them over. 000, he said. The croupier looked bored, which was the way a croupier should look. Gannet reached down and gave the wheel a spin and then stood back and waited. The croupier waited. 2 women and 1 man, on Gannet's right, also waited. The ball clicked merrily, came to a stop. The wheel slowed, finally rested. It wasn't 00. Gannet reached for the croupier's rake and shoved his pile of chips back under the croupier's protecting right hand. "Lousy wheel is fixed," Gannet said. Nobody argued with him on that. He uncorked his Scotch bottle and took a long pull. Nobody objected to that either. The croupier still looked bored, and the two women and the one man waited patiently for the day of judgment. Gannet went over to a cashier window and reached in and got a handful of silver dollars. He took them to the machines over against the far wall and stuck in a couple and pulled the two handles simultaneously. For his investment, he got back $5, which one of the machines disgorged with a loud clatter. He put more dollars in. He put them in fast and pulled the levers fast. He went down the entire row of machines and pulled the levers as he went. He didn't linger to see what happened at any of them. He began to feel cold. He took out his Scotch bottle again and half emptied it. A woman who looked as if she was someone's great-grandmother, except that her hair was bleached and fingernails were sharp talons, and who sat in a chrome and leather chair not 6 feet away from him, stared a little disapprovingly. Gannet caught the look. "Lady," he said defensively, "I earn me holiday, see? It's none of your business if I do some celebrating, is it?" The lady didn't change her mind. She looked as though she might prefer gin herself. Gannet belched. He wasn't so cold now. He threw back his head and laughed and listened to the sound of it bounce off walls. He did it again. He was feeling fine. He went back to the roulette wheel, got around behind it, and nudged the croupier gently. The croupier went over like a broom sliding down the side of a wall. Gannet picked up the little plastic rake and looked at the two women and one man. "Place your bets, folks," he said in a low tone that was a pretty good imitation of the drone of a professional man. He separated the chips into 4 neat piles. He pushed a pile each at the two women, one to the man. The last he kept for himself. "Place your bets, folks," he repeated. Nobody did, but that was okay anyhow. Grinning happily, he made bets for them. One of the women, the one that was red-headed, looked to him as if she might be a plunger. He shoved her pile of chips over onto 0, and then he gave her a friendly little wink. The other woman was the careful type, he thought. Her chips, not all of them of course, he shoved for red. He disposed of the man perfunctorily. $10 on plain number 9. His own bet was due a little more deliberation. He carefully spread around $500 until the strip looked as if 18 people were playing it all at once. The effort made him sweat. He reached for his bottle, emptied it, then dropped it on the fallen croupier. "Folks," Gannet said in an apologetic tone, "you'll have to pardon me for a minute. It seems like I'm out of fuel. Don't go away. I'll be right back." Everybody was agreeable. Gannet went back to the bar, went around behind it. He said to the barman, "I got a party out here, Doc. A big party, see? The house might stand to make a mint. How's about drinks?" The barman considered it. The barman was still considering it when Gannet went back to the wheel with a 5th of Scotch and 4 glasses and a dish of olives. He made drinks. In each one he put an olive. By this time, of course, he was getting a little loud, but nobody could blame him for that. When the drinks were made and placed before the two women and the man, he was ready. He grinned around, rubbed his hands together, and winked a sly little leering wink at the redhead. The wheel spun, stopped. 0. The redhead had brought down the house. "By God!" whispered Gannet in frank admiration. "Lady, you sure got luck. Another little snifter just to nail it tight?" Gannet liked the idea. He drank her drink for her and made a face over the olive. He poured another. He made more bets for everybody and then thought of something. Excusing himself once more,
he got a roll of quarters from the cashier cage and, breaking it open, fed them into a big glittering jukebox over in the corner. That done, he pushed down a row of tabs and went back to the table. Everybody seemed to be having a time. The redhead just couldn't lose. 3 separate times Gannet was forced to collect chips from other tables in order to keep the game going, but he didn't mind. He even said to the redhead once, "Lady, 10 more minutes and we sign the joint over to you. But have fun, you're doing swell." Once more he consulted the thoughtful barman, and more than once he had to go back to the jukebox and punch tabs, but that was all right. He liked music. At 10 minutes past 3 in the morning, with all the chips in the place before the lucky redhead, he finished his last bottle. He lifted his eyes and considered a crystal chandelier which hung from the exact centre of the broad ceiling. It was a beautiful chandelier. It looked as though it might have graced the banquet hall of some castle over in England, back in the days when England was a tight little isle. He grinned appreciatively at it. He pitched the empty bottle upward. There was a crash. Half the lights in the place went out. Bowing solemnly to the scattered immobile figures, Gannet lurched to the big door up front. He tried to bow to the friendly floorman, but it didn't quite go over. He banged through the doors and out into the street. Gannet groaned his aching body out of bed and padded heavily to the window. He put his big hands on the sill and looked out. Purple snow was falling on a quiet world. The flakes came down softly, big, wet, coloured things like fluffy bits of cotton candy escaping from a circus in the sky. There was his jeep down on the street where he had left it. He could recognize it, for it was the only jeep on the block. "Then it wasn't no lousy dream," he said miserably. He went back to the bed and sat down on the edge of it. He recalled the headlines in the paper. "Them lousy Reds," he whispered. "They done this, sure as hell." That made him think a little. Everybody was dead. Even the redhead in the golden bubble who couldn't lose. "What the hell am I doing alive then?" he asked himself. There was no answer to that. He thought of his mine, the lousy disappointment, and wondered if, living most of the time below the surface as he did, he had been protected from some sort of purple gas or something that seemed to have killed off everybody else. It could be. Some very light gas, maybe, that wouldn't seep below the surface. "Oh, for cripe's sakes," he grunted disgustedly. He dressed and left the room. He went downstairs. There was a lobby, all soft, quiet carpeting, and soft, quiet furniture, and soft, quiet drapes. A sheet of paper on a writing desk said Grand Pachapa. He was in a hotel then. He must have wandered into it after he left the golden bubble. He carefully avoided looking at 2 well-dressed women who sat in lobby chairs staring off into nothing, but he felt their presence chillingly. He shivered. He made his way outside, the purple snow coming down and giving his cheeks wet, cold caresses. He angrily brushed them off, but they came down anyway. Above the snow, the sky was a sodden mass of purplish grey. He found a restaurant that was open. A few customers sat on the stools like statues in a museum. All the coffee makers were on the electric stove, but they were dry and clean, except one that had no bottom in it any more and was quite discoloured. Beneath it, the round electric coil still glowed faithfully. He grabbed up one of the clean pots and took it to the metal rinse sink and reached for the faucet. And then his hand froze. What if the water was tainted? He had no way of finding out if it didn't carry that identifying purplish tint. He tried the faucet. It did. The milk in the refrigerator was 3 weeks old, of course.
Gannett ended by opening a bottle of Pepsi-Cola for breakfast. The sky stayed leaden, but even so there were many things apparent now that he hadn't seen the night before. A lack of heavy traffic on the streets would seem to indicate that what had happened, purple gas or whatever, had been very late at night. Even so, traffic accidents were everywhere. There was one big sedan with its front end crushed against the First Olympic Bank. There was one cop who had died trying to tie his right shoe. His fingers still clutched the laces. There was a doctor, his car had a caduceus emblem on the windshield, who had just stepped down to the street, his bag in his left hand and his right hand on the door, ready to slam it shut. He had a serious, purposeful look on his face that even the falling purple snow couldn't quite eradicate. Despite the cold, sweat frosted Gannett's forehead. He made his way to a radio and television store and kicked in a glass panel of the front door. Stepping through to the clamour of the suddenly aroused night warning bell, he went directly to a TV set and turned it on. The big screen tube flickered after a while, and a scratching hum came out of the speaker, but nothing happened. He tried all the channels. Nothing. He tuned in a big radio console next, going carefully and slowly across the dial with a hand that shook. Even though the night warning bell was kicking up quite a racket, he could tell after a moment or two. Nothing. The sky was getting dark as Gannett left the store. The purple snow still fell. It was then that he noticed for the first time the gay street decorations in preparation for Christmas. Big paper bells with plenty of glittering tinsel and electric lamps inside them. On the corner of First and Virginia, he saw a big iron kettle of some Salvation Army Santa. Hanging from its metal tripod, it looked quite natural, except that it was filled with purple snow, and the Santa who was supposed to ring his little bell was holding it stiffly over his head. He and the bell were frozen silent. There was a large department store. Inside, in the show window, was a Christmas display that would delight the kiddies. There was a big Christmas tree trimmed with every imaginable ornament. Beneath the tree, electrically activated toy soldiers jerked robot-like through their precise military designations, their lithographed faces looking stern and very brave. There was a clown who did uncounted somersaults, a lifelike doll who clapped her hands in glee. There was an aluminium bomber with a wing spread of 3 feet. It was held in the air by almost invisible wires, and its 6 propellers droned in perfect unison, making a brisk little wash that rustled the silk of the little doll's dress. And around the base of the tree, through valley and over mountain, into tunnel and over spiderweb trestle, was a railroad track. It should have had busy little trains on it, except that it didn't. The trains had been derailed at a whistle stop called North Pole. Gannett's eyes twitched. The sky grew darker. The purple snow continued to fall silently. Gannett went by the Masonic Lodge, the YMCA, and crossed the little stone bridge over the frozen Truckee River. He came to the heavy grey stone building of First Community Church. He stopped in front of the church and stared at it. It was a solid, respectable-looking building. It was a very nice thing, indeed, to have here in Reno. "Christmas Eve," Gannett whispered through cold lips. "This is Christmas Eve." He went up 6 purple snow-covered stone steps. He reached the top where the stone steps ended and where the big square stone slab was. That slab where the minister stands when the weather is fair and shakes hands with the congregation after the service. Somewhere above, in the steeple, bells struck off the hour of 8. A timing device did that. Many churches had such timing devices to save labour, and as though that were a signal, a loudspeaker, attached way up on the spire, especially for this festive season, began to growl out preparatory scratching noises, like a big metal monster clearing its throat. Gannet pulled on the wrought brass handles of the closed oaken door. The door didn't budge. He grabbed the handles in both hands and braced his feet. He pulled hard. The door was locked. "God," he whispered hoarsely. "God, this is me. I gotta get in. God, God, listen. I gotta get in." High above, in the steeple, the loudspeaker was finally ready with a cheerful little carol. "God rest ye merry gentlemen," the voices of a dead choir roared out upon the silent city. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Fairyland Planet by John Silletto. Originally published in Infinity, October 1958. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Chapter 1. He was about 38 years old, Earth scale, with a sprinkling of premature grey in his thick hair. His stride as he came toward the desk had a youthful bounce, but his eyes were a little less bright than I was accustomed to here in Fairyland. His brows were pulled slightly inward, and he wasn't smiling. "Hi, Mike 1, I said. "Good morning, Daddy." Very formal and solemn. A bad sign, I thought. I gave him a big reassuring grin and waved him into a chair. "This is a pleasant surprise, Mike 1. I hardly ever have a caller during ice cream recess." He squirmed in the chair, looking down at his feet. I could come back later, Daddy." No, I said hastily. "That's all right. A fellow must have something pretty important on his mind to bring him all the way up to Daddy's office at ice cream time." Mike 1 fidgeted. He tugged at a lock of hair and began to twist it. "Well?" "Come on," I cajoled. "What's it all about? That's what Daddy's here for, you know, to listen to your troubles." He scuffed his feet around on the floor. Then he took out a handkerchief and blew his nose. "Well, see, I got a buddy. Well, he ain't really my best buddy, or even second best. Sometimes we play chess together, or checkers, only he thinks checkers is silly." I cleared my throat and smiled patiently, waiting for him to come to the point. When he didn't go on, I said, "What's his name?" Adam." "Adam 2 or 3? "2. I nodded. "Okay, go on." "He talks crazy, and he always wondering about things. I never seen a kid so wonder so much, and he's only 23. I nodded again. "And now he's got you to wondering about something, and you want Daddy to straighten you out, right?" "Uh-huh." "Okay," I said. "Shoot." He sniffed and scuffed his feet and scrooched around in the chair some more. Then suddenly he opened his eyes wide and looked me square in the face and blurted, "Is there really a Santa Claus?" The grin I was wearing froze on my face. It seemed I'd been waiting 20 years for one of the kids to ask me that question. "Daddy, is there a Santa Claus?" A loaded question. Loaded and fused and capable of blasting the Fairyland experiment into space dust. Mike 1 was waiting for an answer. I had to deal with the crisis of the moment and worry about implications later. I stood up and walked around the desk and put my hands on his shoulders. "Mike," I said, "how many Christmases can you remember?" "Gee, Daddy, I don't know. Lots and lots." "Let's see now. You're 38, and Christmas comes twice a year, so that's 2 times 38. 76 Christmases. Of course, you can't remember all of them, but the ones you remember, did you ever not see Santa Claus, Mike?" No, Daddy, I always saw him. Well then, why come asking me if there is such a person when you know there is, because you see him all the time? Mike 1 looked more uncomfortable than ever. Well, Adam 2 says he don't think there is a cold side of number 1, son. He thinks it's hot all the way round, and if that's so, then Santa Claus couldn't live there. He says he thinks Santa Claus is just pretend, and you or somebody from the Council of Uncles dresses up that way at Christmas time. I scowled. How the devil had Adam 2 managed to figure that one out? Listen, Mike, I said. You trust your daddy, don't you? Golly, course I do. All right, then. There is a Santa Claus, Mike 1. He's as real as you or me, or the pink clouds, or the green rain. He's as real as Fairyland itself. So just don't pay any more attention to Adam 2 and his crazy notions, okay? He grinned and stood up, blinking his eyes to hold back the tears. Thank you, Daddy. I clapped him on the back. You're welcome, pal. Now if you hurry, you might just get back down in time for a dish of ice cream. When the indicator over the elevator door told me that Mike 1 had been safely deposited at the bottom of Daddy's tower, I walked across the circular office to the windows facing the compound. Ice cream recess was about over, and the kids were straggling out in all directions from the peppermint-striped ice cream and candy factory just to the right of the midway entrance. Except for the few whose turn it was to learn something new in Mummy's schoolroom, they were on their own from now until lunchtime. It was free play period. From my 100-foot-high vantage point, I watched them go, walking, running, skipping or hopping toward their favourite play spots. They had their choice of the slides and swings in the playground, the swimming pool, tennis courts, ball diamond, gridiron, golf course, bowling alley, and skating rinks, and of course the rides on the midway. I watched them go, and my heart thumped a little faster. My gang, I thought. Not really mine, of course, except from the standpoint of responsibility, but I couldn't have loved them more if I'd sired each and every one of them. And Mummy, sometimes I almost forgot her name was Ruth, felt the same way. It was a funny thing, this paternal feeling, even a little weird if I stopped to remember that a baker's dozen of them were actually older than I. But a child is still a child, whatever his chronological age may be, and the inhabitants of Fairyland were children in every sense except the physical. It was a big job being daddy to so many kids, but one that had set lightly on my shoulders so far. They were a wonderful gang, healthy and happy, really happy, and I couldn't think of a single place in the universe where you'd find another 137 human beings about whom you could make that statement. A wonderful gang, all sizes and shapes and personalities, ranging in physical age from 5 to 43. Mental age, well, that was another story. After years of research and experimentation, we'd settled on 8 as the optimum of mental development. And so, there wasn't a kid in Fairyland mentally older than 8 years. Or was there? Mike 1's confused story of his friend Adam 2 re-echoed in my head. He says he don't think there is a cold side of number 1, son. He thinks it's hot all the way round. He says he thinks Santa Claus is just pretend. Something was wrong. Something big and important and dangerous, and I didn't know what I was going to do about it. Adam 2, unlike some of the older kids, had been born in Fairyland. There wasn't one single solitary thing in his life history to account for this sudden terrifying curiosity and insight. Nothing. Not even prenatal influence, if there is such a thing. I wondered if Ruth had noticed anything strange about him. If so, she'd never mentioned it. I decided I'd better have a daddy and son chat with young Adam right away. I walked through the midway in the warm twin-star sunshine, waving and shouting back at the kids on the rides who shrieked, "Hi, Daddy!" as they caught sight of me. Nobody had seen Adam 2, so I escaped after a brief roller coaster ride. "Oh, come on, Daddy, just once," with a trio of husky 30-year-olds who called themselves the Three Bears. Adam 2 wasn't at the playground either, nor the swimming pool, nor the tennis courts. I decided he must be in the recreation hall, so headed in that direction, taking a shortcut through Pretty Park at the north end of the Midway. The park was a big place, stretching east and west from the baseball diamond to the pony stables at the edge of Camping Woods, and northwards as far as the golf course. This was my favourite spot in Fairyland. I always came here when I wanted to relax or think something through without any interruptions. It had once been an oasis on this otherwise barren desert planet, and therefore the logical site for the Fairyland compound. An underground spring in the centre of the park was our main water supply. The clear, cold fluid bubbled out of the rocks to form a lovely lake which was perhaps 50 yards across at the widest part. The lake shore was ringed with tall, unearthly palm-like trees, strange and beautiful. I found Adam 2 there, beside the lake, sitting on a rock with his shoes and socks off, dangling his bare feet in the cold water and gazing upward into the swaying treetops. "Hi, Adam 2. "Hello." He didn't seem either surprised or glad to see me. He was above average height, well over 6 feet, and exceptionally thin. Physically awkward, too, I remembered. He invariably struck out on the ball diamond, invariably sliced into the rough on the golf course. His hair was dark and curly, and he had a nervous way of ruffling it with his fingers, so that it was always in disarray. But the most unusual thing about him was his eyes. They were ice blue, set deep back under a high, ridged forehead. They stared out at you with a kind of ruthless, unblinking intensity that made you uncomfortable, and I wondered why I'd never noticed those eyes before. It was like looking at a stranger, though I'd known him since he was little more than a baby. I sat down alongside him on the rock. "What you doing?" He didn't answer for a while. His bare feet made white froth in the water. At last he said, "Thinking." I waited, but apparently he wasn't going to elaborate. "I hear tell you've been doing some of your thinking out loud," I said quietly. No answer. "It's all right to think," I went on. "That's good for us. But a fella ought to be careful about sounding off to the other kids about something maybe he don't know anything about." Still no answer. He kept lashing the water with his feet. His indifference and lack of attention were beginning to annoy me, and I was annoyed at myself for being annoyed with him and for beating around the bush with him. "What makes the trees grow?" His query was so sudden and unexpected that it caught me off guard. That made me more annoyed than ever. "You're supposed to have learned that from Mummy in school," I said curtly. Another long pause. "She says the fairies touch the trees and flowers with their magic wands. She says that's what makes them grow." "That's right." "I don't believe in fairies," he said matter-of-factly. I scowled fiercely at him. "Oh, you don't, eh? First it's Santa Claus, now the fairies. The next thing we know you'll stop believing in mummies and daddies." He looked up into the treetops again. "I think the sun has something to do with it," he went on, as though I hadn't said a word. "They seem to be sort of reaching for the sun, as if the sun gave them life." His eyes met mine, cold and intensely blue, and very frank. "Why don't you tell me the truth?" I stood up, fighting to control my rising anger. "Are you calling your daddy a liar?" I shouted. "I only asked a simple question." "All right." I was regaining a little of my composure, but it was evident that I needed more time to think this through. "Let's just forget it for now. Let's go over to the rec hall and have a game of chess, shall we?" Adam was chess champ of Fairyland. Splash, splash, splash. His feet fluttered wildly in the water again. "I can't," he said. Splash, splash, splash. I raised my eyebrows. "Why not?" "I'm not through thinking." What it needs is a spanking, I thought grimly. But spankings were outlawed in Fairyland. They were old-fashioned and conducive to the generation of neurosis. I'd never considered the regulation as a handicap. Until now. "Okay, fella," I said with exaggerated calm. "But just let me hear one more report. Just one, mind you, about you telling the kids there's no Santa Claus or no fairies, and you'll be on the no-ice-cream list for a month." Splash, splash, splash. I get tired of ice cream every day. I stalked away, not trusting myself to speak. That night, after the kids were bedded down in the dormitories, Mummy and I stretched out in our lounge chairs to watch the videocast from Earth. The news was dull, the kind that reminds you history repeats itself, and so what? The Martian colony was complaining about taxes and threatening to secede. The campaign for Galaxy Manager was in full swing, and the network was allotting equal mudslinging and empty promise time to each party. The Solar Congress had doubled the defense budget for next year, and an unconfirmed report had been received that an unidentified spaceship had landed on the dark side of Earth's moon. I yawned and switched off the set. "Why the hell does anybody want to live on Earth?" I said. Ruth smiled at me, a sympathetic, wifely smile. She'd been watching me all evening, and she knew something wasn't right. "What's the matter, Harry?" I sighed. "Tell me about Adam, too." "Oh, him." "Yeah, him." She looked a little embarrassed. "I didn't suppose you knew. Did he tell you?" Now I was confused. "Did he tell me what?" She stood up suddenly. "Stop sparring with me, Harry. Did he tell you or not?" "Tell me what?" I almost shouted it this time. "That he asked me to play house with him." "Ruth!" She laughed a little shakily. "Don't get hysterical, Daddy. I didn't do it." I slumped in my seat. "That's encouraging." "What do you suppose is the matter with him, Harry?" "I was about to ask you the same thing," I said. "I never thought of him as being much different from the rest. A little more shy, maybe, and a little less exuberant on the physical side. Not enough to worry about, though. How's he in school?" She frowned. "He's in the 5th year of 3rd grade now, an above-average student, and very inquisitive, and kind of shy, like you said. I always thought he was well-adjusted, although I don't think he ever plays house with the same girl twice. I just never thought of him as a problem until today. That question." "Yeah," I said wryly. "He seems to be full of questions." I told her about my visit from Mike 1 and the chat with Adam. "Well, Mummy," I said, "it looks like after all these years it's finally happening." "What's finally happening, Daddy?" I sighed. "One of our kids is growing up." Chapter 2. I suppose it was partly my fault that the Adam 2 business very nearly got out of hand during the next few days. In the first place, I was at a loss to know what to do about him, and in the second place, I was sweating day and night over the blankety-blanked annual report for the Council of Uncles, who were due to arrive the following week. I hated paperwork, with the result that I usually got caught short and had to compress a whole year's work into the space of a few days. The Council of Uncles, of course, wasn't really any such thing. The title was just a nickname for the benefit of the kids. Officially, they were the Intergalactic Inspection Council of the Solar Committee for Sociological Research. The purpose of the committee was to find out what people need to be happy, and the purpose of the Inspection Council was to check around and see who was happy and who wasn't. Some 200 years ago, society had reached a kind of static condition in the realm of scientific development. For the first time in 7,000 years of civilization, Man was faced with almost total leisure, and to his great surprise, he found himself no nearer happiness than when he started. And so a crusade had begun. Man decided at last to turn his knack for research and development inward upon himself. Scientists began to ponder and experiment with the questions that had plagued philosophers for ages. The coming of automation had relieved men from the burden of working for a living, and left them with a choice between cultural pursuits and pure recreation. Which should it be? A good deal of rivalry, some friendly and some otherwise, existed between the proponents of the two major schools of thought. The intellectuals were dubbed highbrows. The pleasure boys were known as happy hooligans. Mankind, the highbrows contended, was still undergoing a kind of evolution, a gradual transition from a purely physical or animal existence to a purely mental or intellectual state. The machines had released him from physical bondage, as they had been intended to do, so that he might rise at last above his animal beginnings. Man could now rise to undreamed of cultural heights, or he could sink into the depths of sensual degradation. The choice was up to him, but if he chose the latter, nature might very well not permit him to survive. "Fiddle-de-dee," said the hooligans. The trouble with man was that he has always insisted on pretending to be something he isn't, always seeking some deep meaning and significance in life instead of relaxing and enjoying it. Excessive doses of education and culture merely serve to compound this felony, magnify his inferiority complex, and make him thoroughly unhappy. "Teach people how to enjoy themselves instead of how to be miserable," they cried. Fairyland was a sort of sociological laboratory for the happy hooligans, a colossal, costly experiment that had been going on for some 45 years. It was designed to test the theory that most of the misery in the world stems from the fact that kids are allowed to grow up, to abandon their childhood dreams, to quit having fun. They learn that there really isn't any Santa Claus, and they never quite recover from the shock. So far, the experiment appeared to be a successful one. Fairyland kids were happy kids, and they all believe in Santa Claus. All but one. On day one of that ill-starred week, the merry-go-round on the Midway broke down. Investigation disclosed that Adam 2 had found my toolkit and had disassembled the remote control drive mechanism to find out what makes it go. He was placed on half rations of ice cream for a period of 10 days. On day 2, Adam was discovered late at night, after taps, in the washroom of the boys' dorm, swearing in applicants for Question and Answer Club. When questioned as to the purpose of his so-called club, he refused to answer. His charter members, however, confessed eagerly. The club was to dream up among themselves a question of the week. Questions were to be presented weekly to Mummy and Daddy, and unless satisfactory answers were forthcoming, the club members would refuse to eat. The first question of the week was, why are there two kinds of kids, boys and girls? Adam 2 was placed on no dessert at dinner for a period of 1 week. On day 5, Adam was missing from his bed at taps. He had not registered to spend the night playing house in one of the cottages in Pretty Park either, so I set out to find him. It took me an hour and a half, but I finally located him on the far side of the golf course. He was attacking the Great Wall of Fairyland. The Great Wall, over 100 feet high, surrounded the entire compound. It was encased in a pseudo-gravity field with a repellent force of -3G, and you could no more approach the Great Wall than you could fly. I watched in stunned amazement as Adam 2, the kid who despised football, time after time took a running start, lowered his head, and charged at the wall like a varsity tackler, only to be thrown for a 5-yard loss. When I gathered he had no intention of giving up until he dropped from exhaustion, I walked over to where the G-field had thrown him after his last lunge. "Adam, what are you trying to do?" He stood up, breathing heavily, and brushed himself off. I wanted to see what was on the other side. There's nothing nice over there, I said. It's a bad place. Fairyland is a much nicer place to be. I wanted to see for myself. His voice was as devoid of emotion as his face. Why can't I get near the wall? What is it that throws me back? The fairies have cast a spell on the wall, I said. A magic spell, because they don't want us to go to the bad place. They want us to stay in Fairyland where we're happy. Abruptly, Adam started off across the golf course toward the dormitory. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, Daddy. Adam, too, was placed on limited midway privileges for a period of 4 days. All of which gave me an uneasy and alien feeling of helplessness. My self-confidence, based on 20 years' experience with the kids of Fairyland, and before that 5 years' experience as a space scoutmaster on Earth, was visibly shaken. Adam wasn't just being ornery, the way almost any kid is likely to be at times. If it had been just that, the loss of privileges would have remedied the situation. Neither was he actually malicious. He obviously wasn't out to harm anyone. He was simply curious. Curious in a way that was distinctly unhealthy for the rest of Fairyland. He was growing up, and I didn't know how to cope with him. So I wrote him up in the annual report. Chapter 3. It was a big day in Fairyland whenever the Council of Uncles came. Bigger in a way than either Christmas or circus time, because they came twice a year, and the Council of Uncles only once. I'd adjusted the controls of the weather generators the night before so that arrival day dawned warm and clear. The kids were all dressed in Sunday best, and the festival flags were flying from the tops of all the buildings. Across the side of Daddy's tower that faced the desert and spaceport, a gay multicoloured banner constructed by the third graders proclaimed, "Welcome, Uncles!" The kids were gathered in the courtyard at the foot of the tower, their eyes scanning the green sky for the first glimpse of the Uncle's spaceship. Up in the tower at the radar console, I picked up a blip at about 300 kilomiles. I interrogated, and the target trace blinked in the proper code sequence. I turned on the kiddie-com system and announced that we had just received a message from the cold side of number 1 sun. The sound of cheering drifted up from the courtyard. "The Uncles will be here in 10 minutes, I said. "Mummy, will you lead us in a rehearsal of the welcome song, please?" I stood by the window, listening to the vast sound of 137 voices, each trying to outdo the other in amplitude and sincerity. "Welcome to Fairyland, welcome to Fairyland, welcome, dear Uncles, to Fairyland today." It was discordant, it was childish, it was even ludicrous, but I loved it. I loved it without quite understanding it, and it made me feel happy yet sad at the same time. I took the elevator down to the loading platform and drove the monorail car out to the spaceport, which was 10 miles from Fairyland, across the arid, lifeless desert. We'd built the dock close enough for easy access, yet far enough away so that the awesome sight of a spaceship landing or blasting off wouldn't generate too much curiosity in the kids. It was a link with the outside world, a world that had no reality for them, and for that reason could not stand too close an inspection. The Earth ship was snuggling comfortably into the dock as I climbed out of the car. I ran across the landing platform and pressed the control switch that lowered the gangway against the ship's hatch. Boswell, the council chairman, was first down the gangway. He was short, fat without being flabby, and completely bald except for a fringe of white fuzz around the back of his head and over his ears. He had an oversized nose and bright blue eyes that twinkled perpetually. The kids called him Uncle Chub. "Well, well, well, Harry, you look fine. Fine. Good to see you. How's it going?" "Fine, sir, just fine." His 3 colleagues followed close on his heels. I shook hands with each of them. 2 of them I'd known as long as I had Boswell, ever since I'd become the 3rd daddy of Fairyland. There was old Ika, lean and tall and solemn, with never much to say. The kids called him Uncle Thin. "Good to see you, Harry. How are you doing?" Then there was Hopkins, about my age, and therefore younger than either Boswell or Ika. A nice, medium guy, Hopkins, medium build, medium grey hair, medium voice, affable without being garrulous, intelligent without being stuffy. The kids called him Uncle Hoppy. "Hi, Dad, how's the gang?" The 4th councilman was a stranger. Boswell introduced him as William Pettigrew. He was slightly built, fidgety, shrill-voiced, and weasel-faced. His mouth was fixed in a perpetual smirk, and I formed a dislike for him, immediate and intense. I wondered what the kids would call him, and a suggestion immediately came to mind. Uncle Jerk. "Can't say as I approve of this place at all," said Pettigrew as we climbed aboard the monocar. "Matter of fact, I strongly disapprove." "Well, sir," I said, trying not to gnash my teeth, "I don't quite see how you can be certain until you've seen it." "Principle, matter of principle." I didn't answer. Hoppy called my eye and winked. A rousing cheer came from the kids down in the courtyard as we climbed out of the car. Then I heard the brief, plaintive whimper of Mummy's pitch pipe, and once again the welcome song reverberated throughout Fairyland. The uncles waved down at the kids, with the exception of Pettigrew, who fidgeted until the song was finished. As we descended in the lift, he said, "This place must cost the taxpayers a tidy sum." "As a matter of fact, we're almost self-sustaining," I said. "A few tons of reactive fuel per annum is all we require to—" "Don't humour him, Harry," said Boswell. "Let him read the report." Pettigrew glared, but except for an inaudible mutter, he took Boswell's squelch without comment. I was wondering what significance might be hidden in this addition of a 4th uncle to the council, but I finally shrugged it off. Earthside politics bored the hell out of me. Mummy was waiting to greet us as we stepped out of the elevator, and Uncle Chub gave her a big hug. "How's the First Lady of the Galaxy?" he said, and she brightened as though it were a spontaneous compliment she was hearing for the first time instead of the 20th. Then the kids broke ranks and milled around us, squealing and laughing and firing questions about Santa Claus. Being new, Pettigrew received a good deal of attention. "Who are you? What's your uncle name? Do you live with Santa Claus or with the fairies? How cold is the cold side of number 1 sun? Do you like merry-go-rounds better than roller coasters?" The pelting of this verbal barrage sent him spinning like a crippled spaceship, and I wedged myself through the ring of kids to rescue him. "Come on, gang, break it up." Pettigrew gave me a look of wide-eyed terror. "They're insane," he whispered. "Look at them. They're adults, but they act like children," I said. "That's what they are, Mr. Pettigrew. I thought the other councillors had explained." "They did, but I never thought. Well, I mean, this is awful." I grinned. "You'll get used to it." "Whole thing is ludicrous, ludicrous." He waved an all-encompassing hand that included the kids, Fairyland, its basic concept, and me. I was getting more disenchanted with this character all the time. "Now, just a minute, you." A strong hand closed over my arm, and I looked around into the grinning face of Hoppy. "Let's get the program started, eh?" he said. The next 3 hours were a hodgepodge of well-rehearsed chaos. The council had to inspect everything so they could return a first-hand report to the Solar Committee for Sociological Research, and on the other hand, all the kids had to show off for the uncles. The first stop on the agenda was the Arts and Crafts building, where we exhibited the drawings and clay animals and models and beadwork and 1,001 other items the kids had made with their own hands. From there we adjourned to the school, where Ruth had displayed a few samples of the work of each class. We only have one teacher, I explained to Pettigrew, because each class meets for just an hour a day. We stagger the classes, kindergarten through 3rd grade. The kids spend an average of 5 years in each grade, including kindergarten. Ridiculous! There's nothing ridiculous about it, I said patiently, for the simple reason that they're not in any hurry. Well, I am. Let's get on with it. From the school, the procession migrated to the recreation hall. We visited the game room for demonstrations of checker champ Mike 1 and chess champ Adam 2, then witnessed exhibitions at the bowling alley, basketball court, and the ice and roller rinks. I explained to Pettigrew that each kid was champ of something. There were enough categories for everybody, and nobody was allowed to be champ for more than one thing at a time. Uncle Petty mumbled something I didn't catch. We skirted the midway and took a tour of the pretty park. Here at last was something Pettigrew could accept. He almost smiled as he saw the huge flower beds raised by the botany team. But the almost smile disappeared as we explained to him the purpose of the little cottages nestled among the trees. His eyes bugged, and his face became quite red, and his voice failed him so that he could only sputter. We only retard the mind, I explained, not the body. Playing house is just another recreational activity, like riding the merry-go-round or playing golf. The kids enjoy it, but they don't make a big thing out of it. We treat the whole subject quite casually and frankly. I'll say this for Pettigrew. He had spunk. He swallowed his moral indignation, squared his thin shoulders, took a deep breath, and managed to find his voice. But it failed him again on the word pregnancy. We allow that to occur only rarely, I said. We're building to a static population of 140. At the current rate of $1 per year, in 3 more years we'll... 1 what per year? Dolly. I caught Hoppy's muffled snort behind me and managed to hold down the size of my grin. The kids call it making a dolly. It's a rare treat, and the girls look forward to it. When the danger of apoplexy had subsided, Mr. Pettigrew choked. This is monstrous! Monstrous! And having found the right word, he savoured it. Monstrous! There were too many kids around to pursue the discussion. Little pitches, I thought. I was especially concerned about Adam too, who had been lurking as close to the group of uncles as possible, soaking in every word like a damp sponge. Twice I whispered to Ruth to decoy him out of earshot, but she was too busy to keep an eye on him all the time. She'd no sooner turn her back than he'd edge up through the crowd again, a look of fierce curiosity on his thin face. From the pretty park we made our way to the golf course, the football and baseball fields, then the tennis courts and swimming pool. Demonstrations were given at each stop, with much shouting and applause. After the final demonstration by the diving champ, we made a tour of the dormitories. Pettigrew went through a minor tantrum again when the dolly team showed him through the small maternity ward in the girls' dorm. At last, we filed into the auditorium for the happy show. The kids who weren't champs of some game or craft were all in the happy show. We watched, listened, and applauded for the song champ, the somersault champ, the dancing champ, the yo-yo champ, and many more. The pièce de résistance was a playlet entitled The Uncle's Visit, where 3 of the boys imitated Uncles Chub, Hoppy, and Thin. We hadn't been expecting Uncle Petty, so he wasn't in it. Probably just was as well, I thought. It was a riot. After the show, lollipops were passed out to everybody, and was free time until lunch. Mummy stayed below to keep an eye on things, and I herded the uncles up to the conference room in the tower. Uncle Chub Boswell rapped the meeting to order. He paid me the standard compliment about how healthy and happy the kids looked, and what a fine job Ruth and I were doing here, then asked me to read the annual report. Before I could get my papers in order, Pettigrew piped, "Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask a few pertinent questions." "All right, Petty, make it brief." "Thank you. I should like to ask, what was your name again? Barnaby, I said. Harry Barnaby. Just call me Daddy. He glared my grin into oblivion. Mr. Barnaby, I would like you to explain to me the purpose of this installation. For some reason, the tone of his voice on the word installation infuriated me. What the devil are you driving at? I snapped. There was a faint suggestion of a sneer on his pasty little face. I'm interested in ascertaining, Mr. Barnaby, just how you justify the continued conduction of this perpetual circus and picnic for the mentally retarded at tremendous expense to the taxpayers. I felt an almost irresistible urge to lean across the conference table and hit him in the mouth. I turned to Boswell and said, Chubb, I think you'd better get this pipsqueak out of here. Boswell glowered at Pettigrew. Petty, I told you to watch your lip. I don't have to take that kind of talk from you, Boswell. Yes, you do, as long as I'm chairman of this committee. Don't be surprised if we have a new chairman shortly after we return to Earth, said Mr. Pettigrew smugly. Boswell grinned at me. Mr. Pettigrew figures he's got influence, Harry. He has a second cousin on the Senate Committee of the Galactic Council. Figures he'll have me sacked and make himself chairman. He ain't been a bureaucrat long enough to appreciate the red tape involved in that kind of caper. I laughed and managed to look at Pettigrew without wanting to hit him. I don't mind questions, I said, as long as they're put to me in a civil manner. I'll tell you, Mr. Pettigrew, that the purpose of this installation is we're trying to find out how to make people happy, and we think we've got the answer. Don't let them find out that there's no Santa Claus, that everybody dies, and that it doesn't always pay to be good. Don't let them know that sex is dirty, childbirth is painful, and not everybody can be a champion. Don't let them find out what a stupid, sordid, ugly, ridiculous place the world is. In short, Mr. Pettigrew, don't let them grow up. Nonsense. Nonsense, Mr. Pettigrew? You saw them. You saw how they live. You saw their faces and heard them laugh. Judge for yourself. Pettigrew scowled at me. Am I to understand, Mr. Barnaby, that you seriously propose that this quaint little, experiment be adopted as a way of life for everybody? Why not? I was warming to my subject now, and I leaned across the table toward him. Why not? We've had 7,000 years of civilization. We've spent the first 6,000 learning more and more subtle and complex reasons for hating one another, and the last 1,000 in developing more elaborate and fiendish ways of destroying one another. And out of our so-called scientific advancement, accidentally, has come a thing called automation. The age of the labourer and breadwinner is past. What are we going to do, Mr. Pettigrew? Let man use his leisure time to discover even more effective ways of destroying himself? Or let him live in a fairyland? Uncle Petty turned his head slowly, letting his gaze travel around the room as if he were seeking moral support. He started to say something, then shook his head. Think of it, I went on, a whole world full of happy kids, and a new kind of aristocracy, the daddies and mummies. They and their children would be trained to supervise, to keep an eye on things, just as Ruth and I do here. The kids could be trained to do what little maintenance the machines require. You're insane, Pettigrew exploded. That's it. You're crazier than the rest of them out there. I don't know whether or not I really intended to hit him, or how things might have turned out if I had. Luckily, Boswell jumped to his feet and pulled me back as I made a lunge across the table. Take it easy, Harry, he said quietly. Then he turned to Pettigrew. Petty, we've had enough out of you for today. Open your mouth again, and I'll lock you in the ship till we're ready to leave. Pettigrew slid lower in his chair, and after a brief mumbling was silent. I apologized to Boswell for losing my temper. Forget it, Harry, he chuckled. Wanted to hit him myself lots of times. Well, let's have the report, eh? The bulk of the annual report consisted of a lot of dry statistics about the hydroponics crop, the weight and height of emotional ratings of the kids, reports on certain educational and recreational experiments, and so on. The problem of Adam 2 was the last item on the agenda, and as I read it, they perked up their ears and stopped yawning. And in light of these developments, the undersigned recommends that Adam 2 be transported to Earth and given a normal education so that he may be assimilated into the society. I stood for a moment, holding the papers in my hand, looking from one to the other for that quartet of blank, silent faces. Finally Boswell cleared his throat. "Harry, let me get this straight. You think that this, what's his name, Adam 2, you actually think he's, growing up?" I nodded. There isn't a doubt in my mind, and Ruth agrees. "And you think we ought to take him back to Earth with us?" "Sure, I do. I think that's the only solution, don't you?" Ika coughed discreetly. "I'm afraid it isn't any solution at all." "What would we do with him?" Hoppy wanted to know. "Look," I said, "the kid is a misfit. He doesn't belong here. He belongs on Earth where he can get an education and maybe a chance to make something of himself." Boswell cleared his throat again. "Seems like he'd be a worse misfit on Earth than he is here, Harry." "He would not," I snapped. "He's a sharp kid. He'd adapt himself in no time." Ika spoke up again. "It seems to me we're overlooking an important point here, gentlemen. Isn't Fairyland supposed to be a sort of testing ground for a particular sociological theory? It seems to me we'd be defeating our purpose if we removed this lad just because it doesn't seem to fit. If the world is to be converted to a Fairyland, there'll be more Adam 2s from time to time. What's to be done with them?" "Nuts," I said. "It's not the same problem, and you know it. If the whole world were like this place, Fairyland would be the only reality there was. Guys like Adam would have to accept it. Why don't you just admit that you don't want to be bothered with this?" Boswell rapped for order. "Gentlemen, there's no need to waste any more time with this. Now, Harry, you know we've got no real jurisdiction in this. We're just advisory. The kids are all wards of the solar state, and if you want to appeal for help through official channels, we'll be glad to initiate a request for you when we get back to Earth." I realized now that I might as well have saved my breath. It was the old bureaucratic buck pass. For 20 years, the uncles' visit had been merely an annual ritual, and they intended to keep it that way. They had a nice, soft touch, and they weren't going to let anything spoil it. Sure, they'd initiate a report, and by the time it filtered through the spiral nebula of red tape, Adam and I would both have died of old age. I gathered up my papers. "Just forget it," I said sourly. "If there's no further business, let's adjourn for lunch, and I'll take you back to the ship." At the spaceport, we shook hands, and Hoppy hung back after the others had gone up the gangway. He put his hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry about this Adam thing, Harry." "Forget it. I know how you feel, and I wish we could help, but you know how it is." "Sure, I know how it is." "The administration's all wound up in the rearmament program, doubling the size of the space fleet. Everybody's edgy, wondering whether there's going to be war with the Centauri crowd. Hardly anyone remembers there is such a place as Fairyland. If we go back and kick up a fuss, no telling what might happen. Most of the government budget is earmarked for defence. We might all find ourselves among the unemployed." I looked at him for a long time, until his eyes couldn't meet mine any more. "Hoppy," I said quietly, "how long has it been since they stopped thinking of Fairyland as a practical possibility?" He shrugged, still not looking at me. "I don't know, Harry. 12, maybe 15 years, I suppose. There aren't many happy hooligans around anymore. At least they aren't working at it. They're all getting rich off the defence effort. So they're just letting us drift along out here because it's easier than disbanding the thing and trying to rehabilitate the kids. That right?" He nodded. "That's about it." I took a deep breath and shook my head. "Why, Hoppy? Why?" "Oh, hell," he blurted. "Let's face it, Harry. The whole idea just isn't practical. It would never work." "Never work?" I shouted. "It's been working for 40 years. Sure, it works here. On an isolated desert planet a billion miles from Earth, it works fine. But you can't remake the whole world into a fairyland, Harry. You just can't do it." There was a sinking, sickening feeling in my guts. "Okay, Hoppy, okay. Blast off." He stood looking at me for a moment, then turned and hurried up the gangway. Just as he reached the hatch, 2 figures emerged suddenly from the ship. One wore the uniform of a Space Fleet astronavigator. The other was Adam too. I ran up the gangway in time to hear the navigator telling Hoppy, "I found him in the forward chart room." "Adam!" I yelled. "What are you up to now?" "I wanted to go along," he said. "I wanted to see if they're really going to the cold side of number 1 sun." I grabbed his arm and hustled him down to the monocar. We slid clear of the dock, and about half a mile away I stopped the car to watch them blast off. Adam's eyes were wide with wonderment. "What makes it go?" "Rocket motors," I said absently. I watched the ship, now just a mote disappearing in the twilight sky. And I thought, there goes the tag end of a 20-year dream. That was all it had ever been. I knew that now. Just a dream, and a stupid one at that. I'd deluded myself even more than the kids. "What's a rocket motor?" I looked at Adam. "What? What did you say?" I said, "What's a rocket motor?" "Who said anything about rocket motors?" "You did. I asked you what makes it go, and you said rocket motors." I frowned. "Forget it. Magic makes it go. Santa Claus magic." "Okay, Daddy, sure." Something about his tone made me look sharply at him. He was grinning at me, a cynical, adult-type grin. Yesterday it would have made me furious. Today, for some crazy reason, it made me burst out laughing. I laughed for quite a long time, and then suddenly as it began, it was over. I rumpled his hair and started the car. "Adam," I said, "take a tip from your daddy. Stop trying to find out about things. Hang on to your dreams. Dreams are happy things, and truth is sometimes pretty ugly." Chapter 4. That night after taps, I told Ruth about the council meeting and about my chat with Hoppy at the ship. She came and sat beside me and, in the age-old manner of a loyal wife, assured me that everything was going to be all right. I stood up and began prowling around the room. It's not all right. The plain and simple truth is that we've thrown away 20 years on this pipe dream. All for nothing. "You don't mean that, Harry? Not for nothing?" "The hell I don't. Remember how sceptical we were when we first heard about this place? Then old Hogarth, Daddy too, came to see us. Remember how we fell for it? We were going to be doing something important. We were the vanguard of a world revolution, the greatest thing since the invention of people, a great sociological advancement. What a laugh! Fairyland is nothing but an orphan home. And mark my words, sooner or later they're going to come and close the place down." Ruth patted the seat beside her. "Harry, come back and sit down." I scowled at her, but I sat. "Harry," she said, "I'm just a woman. I don't know much about world revolutions or sociology, but I know one thing. No matter what happens, these 20 years haven't been wasted. We've been happy, Harry, and so have the kids." I wonder, are they happy, Ruth? Do we even know what happiness is? She smiled. "Darling, please don't go abstract on me. I know they're happy." "And what about Adam?" She shook her head. "I suppose he's not, but the percentage is still pretty high, don't you think? You said Fairyland is nothing more than an orphan home, and maybe you're right. I guess I've never really thought of it any other way." I stared at the woman who had been my wife for 23 years as if I'd never seen her before. "You mean you never, not even at the beginning, believed in the idea of Fairyland?" "I just didn't think much about it, Harry. I believed in the kids, that's all. I figured that our job was to look after them and keep them happy and well. We've done that job, and I think it's a pretty fine achievement. I'm proud, for both of us." "Thanks," I said dully. "You know, Mummy, I'd almost forgotten." "Almost forgotten what, Daddy?" I laughed shortly. "What it feels like to find out there's no Santa Claus." In the 2-week interval between Uncle's Day and Christmas too, the air in Fairyland became supercharged with a kind of hushed expectancy, and of course everybody was being extra special good in the manner of kids everywhere during Santa's season. The holiday spirit should have been contagious, but this season I wasn't having any. My pet theory and private dream had been scuttled, so I sulked around feeling sorry for myself. Even Adam too was a model of juvenile deportment. Never late for meals, always washed behind his ears, and best of all, he stopped asking embarrassing questions. This sudden change probably would have made me suspicious if I'd been thinking clearly. As it was, I merely felt grateful. And of course Mummy was too busy helping the girls make popcorn and candy to concern herself with such things. On Christmas Eve, I turned the weather machines to snow, a category specially reserved for our 2 Christmases, and the big, soft, white flakes came drifting lazily down into Fairyland. The lights were out in all the buildings, the kids were asleep, and our 2 moons were bright and full. Ruth and I stood silently on the front porch, watching the snow and the moonlight. "Harry? Do you still think these 20 years were wasted?" I slipped an arm around her waist. "It isn't fair to ask me that on a night like this. But if they were, I'm glad we wasted them together." She leaned over and kissed my cheek. "Thank you, Daddy. Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Mummy." The next morning I donned my pillow-stuffed Santa uniform and itchy white whiskers and stood with Mummy on the auditorium stage, beaming into a bright sea of expectant faces. "Merry Christmas, everybody! Merry Christmas! Ho, 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 ho!" "Merry Christmas, Santa Claus!" came the answering chorus. "Did you all manage to bust up your toys from last Christmas?" "Yes!" "Good!" I boomed. "Ho, ho, ho! Can't get new ones unless we bust up the old ones, you know." We all sang Christmas in Fairyland, and then it was present passing time. Santa's space sled was behind me, chock full of toys. I reached back and pulled out a package. "Julia 3! "Here I am, Santy!" She came running down the aisle, a lovely blonde of about 25, curls flying. "Have you been a good girl, Julia 3? "Yes, Santy." "And you wanted a new dolly?" She nodded emphatically. "You broke your dolly from last Christmas?" "Yes, Santy." "Fine." She took her present and went skipping off to the far side of the stage. Everything went smoothly for perhaps half an hour, and the sled was about half empty when I snagged a small flat package marked Adam 2. He strolled down the aisle and up onto the stage. His eyes were bright, a little too bright, and there was just the hint of a smile on his thin face. "Well, well, Adam 2, have you been a good boy?" "Not very." I gave him a fierce Santa Claus frown. "Well, now, that's too bad, but old Santa's glad that you're honest about it. By the way, you didn't send old Santa a letter, did you?" "No, I didn't think I'd get a present because I wasn't good. Anyway, I didn't know what I wanted." He was staring fixedly at my beard. "Well, suppose we give you a present anyway, and you try very hard to be good between now and next Christmas, eh? Ho, 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 ho!" We'd gotten him a set of chessmen. He took the package without looking at it. "Where's Daddy?" he asked suddenly. It was so unexpected, so matter-of-fact, that it caught me off balance. The kids were always too excited on Christmas morning to worry about where Daddy might be. "Well, sir, ho, 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 Daddy was kind of sleepy this morning, so he thought he'd rest up a bit and let Mummy and Santa Claus look after things. Merry Christmas, Adam, too. Now, let's see who's next." I turned to pull another package from the sled, and Adam took one quick step forward, grabbed my beard, and yanked hard. It came away in his hands, and there I stood with my naked daddy face exposed to all the kids. The silence was immediate and deadly. Then I heard Adam's sudden, sharp intake of breath. I was almost like a sob. I glanced at him for just an instant, but in that instant I glimpsed the terrible disappointment he must have felt. It was all there, in his eyes and in his face. He hadn't wanted that beard to come off. He'd wanted Santa Claus to be real. He turned away from me and faced the kids, holding that phony beard high over his head. "You see," he shrilled, "it's just like I said. There really isn't any Santa Claus. He's just make-believe like the fairies and—" His voice broke, and he threw the beard down, jumped off the stage, and ran toward the exit. Ruth called to him, "Adam, come back here at once." "Let him go, Mummy." I looked ruefully out at our stunned and silent audience. "We've got something more important to do first." I stepped forward and pulled off my Santa Claus hat. For a long moment I just stood there, trying to decide what to say. Even if I'd had my speech rehearsed, I don't think I could have talked around the lump in my throat. I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow I had failed them. It was a feeling that went much deeper than my inability to cope with Adam 2 and his problem. It was a real, deep-down hollow feeling that stemmed from my conviction, ever since the uncle's visit, that the whole idea of Fairyland was a mistake. I wanted to talk to each and every one of them, alone. I wanted to tell them, "It's going to be all right. Mummy and Daddy love you and will always look after you, so you mustn't worry." So I stood there on the stage in my ridiculous padded Santa suit, and somehow managed to smile. "Kids," I said, "Daddy's sure sorry, but you see Santa Claus just couldn't make it today. His spaceship broke down, like a merry-go-round, remember? So Santa asked Daddy to pretend." Down in the front row, 9-year-old Molly 5 suddenly began to sob. 2 rows behind her, 13-year-old Mary 3 took up the cry. Then across the aisle from Mary, another girl wailed, "I want Santa Claus!" In the back of the auditorium, 15-year-old Johnny 4 shouted, "We hate you! You're a mean old daddy!" And there in the aisle, pointing an accusing finger at me, was 38-year-old Mike 1, who brought his Santa problem to me. Was it only 3 weeks ago? Mike 1, his arm extended, his chin trembling, yelling, "You lied to me! You lied! Lied! Lied!" It took the better part of an hour to restore a semblance of order. When the first shock was over, and the hysterical, contagious tears had subsided a little, Mummy and I managed to convince the kids, at least most of them, that Santa was alive and well, that he was very sorry he couldn't make it, but if they'd be good and not fuss about it, they'd all get something extra special next Christmas. Just for good measure, we doubled the ice cream ration for the next 2 weeks. When it was over, I went looking for Adam 2. I was boiling mad, and I knew I ought to wait until I cooled off before having it out with him. But after what he'd pulled today, I didn't dare trust him out of my sight that long. I knew that my anger was irrational, but the knowledge didn't help much. I found him behind the picnic grounds, throwing snowballs at the Great Wall. He was using the force field like a billiard cushion to bank his shots back in toward the trees. He saw me coming and waited quietly, idly tossing a snowball from one hand to the other. For a moment I thought he might be going to heave it at me, but then he looked down at it, as if it was something he'd outgrown, and tossed it indifferently aside. The expression on his face was not one of defiance or arrogance, but neither was it that of a boy who was sorry he'd been naughty. I guess it was sort of a waiting look. "Well, son," I said, surprised that my anger had suddenly evaporated, "you sure messed things up, didn't you?" "I guess I did all right." "You're not sorry?" "I had to find out." I nodded. "And you figure you did find out, is that it?" "Yes." "You wouldn't believe me if I told you that Santa just couldn't get here, that he asked me to pretend to be him so the kids wouldn't be disappointed." He shook his head. "No, I wouldn't believe it." For a moment the anger boiled up in me again, and I wanted to grab him and shake him. I had a crazy notion that if I shook him hard enough I could shake him back into the mould and make him once again just a kid in Fairyland. Then everything would be all right. I bent over and made a snowball and heaved it at the wall, to give my hands something to do. My throw was too straight, and the force field kicked it back at us. We both ducked as it whizzed over our heads, then grinned at each other. "Come on over to Mummy's and Daddy's house," I said. "I want to talk to you." We trudged along through the 3-inch snow, down the path between the circus grounds and the dormitories. The kids were drifting back from lunch, and noticed the noise level was considerably lower than on any other Christmas I could remember. They hadn't completely recovered yet, and they probably wouldn't for a long time. I didn't know what to do about it, except to sweat it out. Ruth greeted us at the door. "Hello, Adam," she said. "Come on in." "You're not angry with me?" She shook her head. "We know you couldn't help yourself, don't we, Daddy?" "I guess so," I said dryly. We went into the living room, and I waved Adam to his seat. I stretched out in my favourite chair lounge, feeling suddenly very old and very tired. Adam sat forward in his chair, watching me with that waiting look, defiant yet shy, courageous yet a little afraid, resigned and yet hopeful. "Adam," I said at last, "what are you trying to prove? What is it you want?" He wet his lips and lowered his eyes for a moment. Then his gaze met mine without flinching. "It's like I told you once before," he said quietly. "I just want to know the truth, the real truth, about everything." I got to my feet and began to slowly pace the floor. I paused in front of Ruth's chair and looked down at her. She caught my hand, gave it a squeeze, and nodded. I turned back to Adam. "You won't like it," I said. "Maybe not, but I gotta know. Just gotta." "Not gotta," Ruth corrected automatically. "Have to." "I have to know." I paced 3 more laps, still hesitating. I felt like a surgeon, trying to decide whether or not to operate when it's a toss-up whether the operation will kill the patient or cure him. "All right, Adam," I said wearily. "You win. But you have to promise me something. Promise me that you'll never say anything to the other kids about what I'm going to tell you." Now it was his turn to weigh a decision, and I could feel the battle going on behind those crystal-clear eyes. His innate honesty battling with his insatiable curiosity. He considered for perhaps a full minute. Then he nodded. "Okay, I don't think it's right not to tell kids the truth, but I promise." Cross your heart. Cross my heart. I took a deep breath, signalled Ruth to make some coffee, and began. You were right about Santa Claus, Adam. He's just make-believe, and so are the fairies. Santa Claus was invented by mummies and daddies to represent the spirit of Christmas for kids too little to understand its real meaning. People on Earth still observe the holiday, although they've gradually forgotten what it really stands for. I'll explain that part to you later. What's Earth, Daddy? Earth is where everybody lived before there were any spaceships. It's a big place, and some of it's nice, and some of it not so nice. The people live in houses, something like this one, and the ones in a house are called families. There's a mummy and a daddy for each family, and their kids live in the house with them. Where do the kids come from? From the mummy. It's the same as what we call making a dolly. Oh. I talked for 6 hours, until I was so hoarse my voice was cracking on every other word. He took it all in stride, injecting a question here and there, absorbing it all like an unemotional sponge. But when I began to talk about war, he became a little upset. I explained how it had begun as individual struggles for survival or supremacy in the days of the cavemen, how it had evolved along with society into struggles between families and tribes, then nations, and now, between planets. But why do they kill each other, Daddy? That doesn't prove anything. I laughed. Son, if I could answer that one, I'd be Daddy number 1 of the whole universe. We finally packed Adam off to bed in the spare room, after promising him we'd talk some more the next night. I'd shown him my library, and told him he could come and read any time he liked, though of course he mustn't take any books out of the house where the kids might see them. Ruth and I stood on the front porch for a while in the moonlight, gazing out over our once peaceful little world. Harry, what will become of him? I don't know. He'll have to decide for himself. He became a man tonight, you know. I'd like him to stay, but I imagine he'll want to go to Earth. He's got a mind that just won't stop. The best thing we can do is try to teach him the things he'll need to survive in that cockeyed world, and turn him loose. It's no good trying to hang on to your kids once they're grown up, Mummy. She shivered a little and moved closer to me. I suppose you're right. I think I know now why mothers hate to see their children grow up. I put my arm around her and gave her an affectionate squeeze. He'll be all right. You know, in a way, I'm almost glad this happened. Maybe, just maybe, Adam has given us the answer. Maybe the thing to do is not to keep them kids all their lives, but to let them grow up more slowly, in their own time, instead of to some prescribed formula. The world has kept getting more complicated all the time, and a kid just can't grow up in it as easily as before. When we were in bed, just before I put out the light, I said, I guess I can answer your question now, Mummy. I don't still think these 20 years were wasted. If I had to do it over again, I'd still want to be Daddy of Fairyland. Chapter 5. The next morning at breakfast time, I went upstairs and knocked on the door of Adams's room. He called to me to come in, and I opened the door, then stopped, 1 foot over the threshold. Across the room, admiring his bewhiskered face in the mirror, was Santa Claus. Ho, 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 he boomed in a perfect imitation of my own Santa voice. Merry Christmas, Daddy. He tugged at the beard, and there was the grinning face of Adam too. I found it in the closet, he said. Do I look the part? I laughed. For a minute, I thought you were the real thing. He looked away. I guess you know I'll want to go to Earth to live. I nodded. It will be pretty rough at first, you realize that? Yes, I expect it will. Daddy, I'm sorry I messed up Christmas for the kids yesterday. I'd kind of like to make up for it by playing Santa for them today. Will you stand by me in case some smarty-pants tries to snatch my beard off? I grinned at him, but I didn't say anything because I discovered there was a strange kind of lump in my throat. I was thinking too, he went on, that maybe I could come back with a supply ship each Christmas and do the same thing if you'd like me to. I cleared my throat. That would be fine, Adam. He hesitated again, then blurted, It isn't right, you know. Fairyland, I mean. It isn't fair to kids not to let them grow up, and it isn't the answer to all the things you told me are wrong about the world. I know, Adam, I know. Sooner or later they'll realize that, on Earth. I think they already have, I said. He scratched his chin under the beard. Then some day they might decide to close Fairyland, mightn't they? So I was thinking, maybe each Christmas time you and Mummy could choose 2 or 3 of the older kids and sort of get them ready for the world, the way you did me. Then I could take them back to Earth with me and help them get started. You could tell the other kids they went to live with Santa Claus. I stared at him in amazement. This kid. I couldn't think of him any other way. Yesterday had been little more than a juvenile delinquent. Today he was a mature, thinking adult who in a few sparse words had provided the answer to the question that had been gnawing at me for 2 weeks. What was to become of Fairyland? I felt the way a father must feel when he suddenly realizes his boy has grown up and has turned out all right. Kind of proud, and more than a little grateful. I gripped Adams's hand. Son, you've got yourself a deal. Come along and let's surprise the kids. I went down the stairs arm in arm, and I called to Ruth. Hey, Mummy, guess what? There really is a Santa Claus after all.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story.
The Festival by H.P. Lovecraft. Originally published in Weird Tales, January 1925. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Efficient demons ut qua non sunt, sic tamen quasi sint, conspiendia hominibus exhibiant. Lactantius. I was far from home, and the spell of the eastern sea was upon me. In the twilight I heard it pounding on the rocks, and I knew it lay just over the hill where the twisting willows writhed against the clearing sky and the first stars of evening. And because my fathers had called me to the old town beyond, I pushed on through the shallow, new-fallen snow along the road that soared lonely up to where Aldebaran twinkled among the trees, on toward the very ancient town I had never seen but often dreamt of. It was the Yuletide, which men called Christmas, though they know in their hearts it is older than Bethlehem and Babylon, older than Memphis and mankind. It was the Yuletide, and I had come at last to the ancient sea town where my people had dwelt and kept festival in the elder time when festival was forbidden, where also they had commanded their sons to keep festival once every century, that the memory of primal secrets might not be forgotten. Mine were an old people, old even when this land was settled 300 years before, and they were strange because they had come as dark, furtive folk from opiate southern gardens of orchids, and spoken another tongue before they learnt the tongue of the blue-eyed fishers. And now they were scattered, and shared only the rituals of mysteries that none living could understand. I was the only one who came back that night to the old fishing town as legend bade, for only the poor and the lonely remember. Then beyond the hill's crest I saw Kingsport outspread frostily in the gloaming, snowy Kingsport with its ancient vanes and steeples, ridge-poles and chimney-pots, wharves and small bridges, willow trees and graveyards, endless labyrinths of steep, narrow, crooked streets, and dizzy church-crowned central peak that time durst not touch, ceaseless mazes of colonial houses piled and scattered at all angles and levels like a child's disordered blocks, antiquity hovering on grey wings over winter-whitened gables and gambrel roofs, and against the rotting wharves the sea pounded, the secretive immemorial sea out of which the people had come in the elder time. Beside the road at its crest a still higher summit rose, bleak and windswept, and I saw that it was a burying ground where black gravestones stuck ghoulishly through the snow like the decayed fingernails of a gigantic corpse. The printless road was very lonely, and sometimes I thought I heard a distant horrible creaking as of a gibbet in the wind. They had hanged 4 kinsmen of mine for witchcraft in 1692, but I did not know just where. As the road wound down the seaward slope, I listened for the merry sounds of a village at evening, but did not hear them. Then I thought of the season, and felt that these old Puritan folk might well have Christmas customs strange to me, and full of silent hearthside prayer. So after that I did not listen for merriment or look for wayfarers, but kept on down past the hushed, lighted farmhouses and shadowy stone walls to where the signs of ancient shops and sea taverns creaked in the salt breeze, and the grotesque knockers of pillared doorways glistened along deserted, unpaved lanes in the light of little curtained windows. I had seen maps of the town, and knew where to find the home of my people. It was told that I should be known and welcomed, for village legend lives long, so I hastened through Back Street to Circle Court, and across the fresh snow on the one full flagstone pavement in the town, to where Green Lane leads off behind the market house. I was glad I had chosen to walk. The white village had seemed very beautiful from the hill, and now I was eager to knock at the door of my people, the 7th house on the left in Green Lane, with an ancient peaked roof and jutting second story, all built before 1650. There were lights inside the house when I came upon it, and I saw from the diamond window panes that it must have been kept very close to its antique state. The upper part overhung the narrow grass-grown street, and nearly met the overhanging part of the house opposite, so that I was almost in a tunnel, with the low stone doorstep wholly free from snow. There was no sidewalk, but many houses had high doors reached by double flights of steps with iron railings. It was an odd scene, and because I was strange to New England, I had never known its like before. Though it pleased me, I would have relished it better if there had been footprints in the snow, and people in the streets, and a few windows without drawn curtains. When I sounded the archaic iron knocker, I was half afraid. Some fear had been gathering in me, perhaps because of the strangeness of my heritage, and the bleakness of the evening, and the queerness of the silence in that aged town of curious customs. And when my knock was answered, I was fully afraid, because I had not heard any footsteps before the door creaked open. But I was not afraid long, for the gowned, slippered old man in the doorway had a bland face that reassured me, and though he made signs that he was dumb, he wrote a quaint and ancient welcome with a stylus and wax tablet he carried. He beckoned me into a low candlelit room with massive exposed rafters and dark, stiff, sparse furniture of the 17th century. The past was vivid there, for not an attribute was missing. There was a cavernous fireplace and a spinning wheel at which a bent old woman in loose wrapper and deep poke bonnet sat back toward me, silently spinning despite the festive season. An infinite dampness seemed upon the place, and I marvelled that no fire should be blazing. The high-backed settle faced the row of curtained windows at the left, and seemed to be occupied, though I was not sure. I did not like everything about what I saw, and felt again the fear I had had. This fear grew stronger from what had before lessened it, for the more I looked at the old man's bland face, the more its very blandness terrified me. The eyes never moved, and the skin was too like wax. Finally I was sure it was not a face at all, but a fiendishly cunning mask. But the flabby hands, curiously gloved, wrote genially on the tablet, and told me I must wait a while before I could be led to the place of festival. Pointing to a chair, table, and pile of books, the old man now left the room, and when I sat down to read, I saw that the books were hoary and mouldy, and they included old Morister's wild Marvels of Science, the terrible Sadducismus Triumphatus of Joseph Glanville, published in 1681, the shocking De Molatrea of Remigius, printed in 1595 at Lyons, and worst of all, the unmentionable Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, in Olaus Wormius' forbidden Latin translation, a book which I had never seen, but of which I had heard monstrous things whispered. No one spoke to me, but I could hear the creaking of signs in the wind outside, and the whir of the wheel as the bonneted old woman continued her silent spinning. I thought the room and the books and the people very morbid and disquieting, but because an old tradition of my father's had summoned me to strange feastings, I resolved to expect queer things. So I tried to read, and soon became tremblingly absorbed by something I found in that accursed Necronomicon, a thought and a legend too hideous for sanity or consciousness. But I disliked it when I fancied I heard the closing of one of the windows that the settled faced, as if it had been stealthily opened. It had seemed to follow a whirring that was not of the old woman's spinning wheel. This was not much, though, for the old woman was spinning very hard, and the aged clock had been striking. After that I lost the feeling that there were persons on the settle, and was reading intently and shudderingly when the old man came back, booted and dressed in a loose antique costume, and sat down on that very bench so that I could not see him. It was certainly nervous waiting, and the blasphemous book in my hands made it doubly so. When 11 o'clock struck, however, the old man stood up, glided to a massive carved chest in a corner, and got 2 hooded cloaks, one of which he donned, the other of which he draped around the old woman, who was ceasing her monotonous spinning. Then they both started for the outer door, the woman lamely creeping, and the old man, after picking up the very book I had been reading, beckoning me as he drew his hood over that unmoving face or mask. We went out into the moonless and tortuous network of that incredibly ancient town, went out as the lights in the curtained windows disappeared one by one, and the dog-star leered at the throng of cowled, cloaked figures that poured silently from every doorway and formed monstrous processions up this street and that, past the creaking signs and antediluvian gables, the thatched roofs and the diamond-paned windows, threading precipitous lanes where decaying houses overlapped and crumbled together, gliding across open courts and churchyards where the bobbing lanterns made eldritch drunken constellations. Amid these hushed throngs I followed my voiceless guides, jostled by elbows that seemed preternaturally soft, and pressed by chests and stomach that seemed abnormally pulpy, but seeing never a face and hearing never a word. Up, the eerie columns slithered, and I saw that all the travellers were converging as they flowed near a sort of focus of crazy alleys at the top of a high hill in the centre of the town, where perched a great white church. I had seen it from the road's crest when I looked at Kingsport in the new dusk, and it had made me shiver because Aldebaran had seemed to balance itself a moment on the ghostly spire. There was an open space around the church, partly a churchyard with spectral shafts, and partly a half-paved square swept nearly bare of snow by the wind, and lined with unwholesomely archaic houses having peaked roofs and overhanging gables. Death fires danced over the tombs, revealing gruesome vistas, through queerly failing to cast any shadows. Past the churchyard, where there were no houses, I could see over the hill's summit and watch the glimmer of stars on the harbour, though the town was invisible in the dark. Only once in a while a lantern bobbed horribly through serpentine alleys on its way to overtake the throng that was now slipping speechlessly into the church. I waited till the crowd had oozed into the black doorway, until all the stragglers had followed. The old man was pulling at my sleeve, but I was determined to be the last. Then finally I went, the sinister man and the old spinning woman before me. Crossing the threshold into that swarming temple of unknown darkness, I turned once to look at the outside world as the churchyard phosphorescence cast a sickly glow on the hilltop pavement. And as I did so, I shuddered, for though the wind had not left much snow, a few patches did remain on the path near the door, and in that fleeting backward look it seemed to my troubled eye that they bore no mark of passing feet, not even mine. The church was scarce lighted by all the lanterns that had entered it, for most of the throng had already vanished. They had streamed up the aisle between the high white pews to the trapdoor of the vaults which yawned loathsomely open just before the pulpit, and were now squirming noiselessly in. I followed dumbly down the foot-worn steps and into the dank, suffocating crypt. The tale of that sinuous line of night marchers seemed very horrible, and as I saw them wriggling into a venerable tomb, they seemed more horrible still. Then I noticed that the tomb's floor had an aperture down which the throng was sliding, and in a moment we were all descending an ominous staircase of rough-hewn stone, a narrow spiral staircase, damp and peculiarly odorous, that wound endlessly down into the bowels of the hill, past monotonous walls of dripping stone blocks and crumbling mortar. It was a silent, shocking descent, and I observed after a horrible interval that the walls and steps were changing in nature, as if chiselled out of the solid rock. What mainly troubled me was that the myriad footfalls made no sound and set up no echoes. After more eons of descent, I saw some side passages or burrows leading from unknown recesses of blackness to this shaft of nighted mystery. Soon they became excessively numerous, like impious catacombs of nameless menace, and the pungent odour of decay grew quite unbearable. I knew we must have passed down through the mountain and beneath the earth of Kingsport itself, and I shivered that a town should be so aged and maggoty with subterraneous evil. Then I saw the lurid shimmering of a pale light, and heard the insidious lapping of sunless waters. Again I shivered, for I did not like the things that the night had brought, and wished bitterly that no forefather had summoned me to this primal rite. As the steps and the passage grew broader, I heard another sound, the thin, whining mockery of a feeble flute, and suddenly there spread out before me the boundless vista of an inner world, a vast fungus shore littered by a belching column of sick greenish flame, and washed by a wide oily river that flowed from abyss frightful and unsuspected to join the blackest gulfs of immemorial ocean. Fainting and gasping, I looked at that unhallowed Erebus of Titan toadstools, leprous fire, and slimy water, and saw the cloaked throngs forming a semicircle around the blazing pillar. It was the Yule rite, older than man and fated to survive him, the primal rite of the solstice and of spring's promise beyond the snows, the rite of fire and evergreen, light and music, and in that Stygian grotto I saw them do the rite and adore the sick pillar of flame, and throw into the water handfuls gouged out of the viscous vegetation which glittered green in the choleric state. I saw this, and I saw something amorphously squatted far away from the light, piping noisomely on a flute, and as the thing piped I thought I heard noxious muffled flutterings in the fetid darkness where I could not see. But what frightened me most was that flaming column, spouting volcanically from depths profound and inconceivable, casting no shadows as healthy flame should, and coating the nitrous stone above with a nasty venomous verdigris. For in all that seething combustion no warmth lay, but only the clamminess of death and corruption. The man who had brought me now squirmed to a point directly beside the hideous flame, and made stiff ceremonial motions to the semicircle he faced. At certain stages of the ritual they did grovelling obeisance, especially when he held about his head that abhorrent Necronomicon he had taken with him, and I shared all the obeisances because I had been summoned to this festival by the writings of my forefathers. Then the old man made a signal to the half-seen flute-player in the darkness, which player thereupon changed its feeble drone to a scarce louder drone in another key, precipitating as it did so a horror unthinkable and unexpected. At this horror I sank nearly to the listened earth, transfixed with a dread not of this nor any world, but only of the mad spaces between the stars. Out of the unimaginable blackness beyond that gangrenous glare of that cold flame, out of the Tartarian leagues through which that oily river rolled uncanny, unheard, and unsuspected, there flopped rhythmically a horde of tame, trained, hybrid winged things that no sound eye could ever wholly grasp or sound brain ever wholly remember. They were not altogether crows, nor moles, nor buzzards, nor ants, nor vampire bats, nor decomposed human beings, but something I cannot and must not recall. They flopped limply along, half with their webbed feet and half with their membranous wings, and as they reached the throng of celebrants, the cowled figures seized and mounted them, and rode off one by one along the reaches of that unlighted river, into pits and galleries of panic where poisoned springs feed frightful and undiscoverable cataracts. The old spinning woman had gone with the throng, and the old man remained only because I had refused when he motioned me to seize an animal and ride like the rest. I saw when I staggered to my feet that the amorphous flute-player had rolled out of sight, but that two of the beasts were patiently standing by. As I hung back, the old man produced his stylus and tablets and wrote that he was the true deputy of my fathers who had founded the Yule worship in this ancient place, that it had been decreed that I should come back, and that the most secret mysteries were yet to be performed. He wrote this in a very ancient hand, and when I still hesitated, he pulled from his loose robe a seal ring and a watch, both with my family arms, to prove that he was what he said. But it was a hideous proof, because I knew from old papers that that watch had been buried with my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather in 1698. Presently, the old man drew back his hood and pointed to the family resemblance in his face, but I only shuddered, because I was sure that the face was merely a devilish waxen mask. The flopping animals were now scratching restlessly at the lichens, and I saw that the old man was nearly as restless himself. When one of the things began to waddle and edge away, he turned quickly to stop it, so that the suddenness of his motion dislodged the waxen mask from what should have been his head. And then, because that nightmare's position barred me from the stone staircase down which we had come, I flung myself into the oily underground river that bubbled somewhere to the caves of the sea, flung myself into that putrescent juice of earth's inner horrors before the madness of my screams could bring down upon me all the charnel legions these pest gulfs might conceal. At the hospital they told me I had been found half frozen in Kingsport harbour at dawn, clinging to the drifting spar that accident sent to save me. They told me I had taken the wrong fork of the hill road the night before, and fallen over the cliffs at Orange Point, a thing they deducted from prints found in the snow. There was nothing I could say, because everything was wrong. Everything was wrong, with a broad window showing a sea of roofs in which only about 1 in 5 was ancient, and the sound of trolleys and motors in the street below. They insisted that this was Kingsport, and I could not deny it. When I went delirious at hearing that the hospital stood near the old churchyard on Central Hill, they sent me to St. Mary's Hospital in Arkham, where I could have better care. I liked it there, for the doctors were broad-minded, and even lent me their influence in obtaining the carefully sheltered copy of Alhazred's objectionable Necronomicon from the library of Miskatonic University. They said something about a psychosis, and agreed that I had better get my harassing obsessions off my mind. So I read again that hideous chapter, and shuddered doubly because it was indeed not new to me. I had seen it before, let footprints tell what they might, and where it was I had seen it were best forgotten. There was no one, in waking hours, who could remind me of it, but my dreams are filled with terror because of phrases I dare not quote. I dare quote only one paragraph, put into such English as I can make from the awkward low Latin. "The nethermost caverns," wrote the mad Arab, "are not for the fathoming of eyes that see, for their marvels are strange and terrific. Cursed the ground where dead thoughts live new and oddly bodied, and evil the mind that is held by no head. Wisely did Ibn Shakabak say that happy is the tomb where no wizard hath lain, and happy the town at night whose wizards are all in ashes. For it is of old rumour that the soul of the devil-bought hastes not from his charnel clay, but fats and instructs the very worm that gnaws, till out of corruption horrid life springs, and the dull scavengers of earth wax crafty to vex it, and swell monstrous to plague it. Great holes secretly are digged where earth's pores ought to suffice, and things have learned to walk that ought to crawl."
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And don't forget to check out the channel. There's hundreds of stories. Hundreds of stories.